Welcome to the channel Breaking Soy. BL's story of love. If you've turned on this story, get comfortable, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and allow yourself to live through it to the end. If difficult but honest stories about pregnant omegas clawing their way out of hell speak to you, don't forget to support the channel with a subscription and a like. That's how you signal that you want more of these forbidden stories. He had learned to make himself small long before the city tried to erase him from its records. Being invisible was cheaper than papers, safer than asking for help. It meant no landlord contracts, no official job, no doctor who might ask too many questions. His room was a box at the end of a long, tired corridor in a hostel that pretended to be a residential building. The lock stuck, the walls smelled of damp and old oil, and the window didn't look out at the city, but at the brick wall of the neighboring house. It was almost convenient. Less light, fewer chances that someone would notice he was living there at all. He had a narrow bed, a table cobbled together from two different pieces of furniture, and a dresser with one drawer that jammed if you pushed it in too hard. At the bottom of that drawer, under stray receipts and cheap t-shirts, lay the test. White plastic, two dull lines. He knew the numbers on the box meant something about weeks, but he didn't want to remember. 2 lines were enough. Pregnancy wasn't a miracle. It was a consequence. The alpha who had given it to him had first looked like salvation. Older, confident, with money, an expensive scent, and that calm voice that made you want to believe promises. He brought him coffee during his first shift at the cafe, left generous tips, asked if it was hard to stand all day. After a couple of weeks, he was already picking him up after work in his car, and after a couple of months, he moved him out of his rented room into the center. The first days in that house felt like another world. White sheets, hot water at any time, clothes he didn't have to buy himself. The alpha said pretty things about how the omega would never again have to count coins in his pockets. There had been no threat in his voice then, only a sticky, sugary certainty that made you want to close your eyes and stop thinking. Then the little rules started appearing one by one. First, he asked him not to take extra shifts anymore. "I'll provide," he said lightly, almost tenderly. Then, not to meet with certain friends. "They're not good for you." Then, not to wear anything the alpha thought was too revealing. Then, not to argue when he came home late and smelling of other people's scents. The first hit didn't arrive as a hit. A hand across the cheek, sharp, quick, followed by a whisper that it was, "Your own fault, you pushed me." He still tried to explain it to himself as an accident, a bad day, frayed nerves. People with money snapped too. With time, there were no excuses left. Control turned into a prison. Jealousy became a routine part of the day. He stopped choosing for himself what to eat, where to go, who to talk to. The house had a lot of glass and very little air. The pregnancy happened as if it had been planned, but without discussion. The alpha never asked if he wanted a child. He just stopped bringing pills, and when the test showed 2 lines, he smirked and said it was an interesting twist. There was no joy in his words, only a new kind of ownership. It ended stupidly. One day he stayed late after a shift because a coworker asked him to cover for an hour. On him clung someone else's cheap perfume, the smell of someone else's shampoo. The alpha caught it in the corridor. The scene wasn't long. A few cold questions, one glance, lips pressed into a hard line. Then the wardrobe door yanked open, the backpack he used. Things thrown into it with the same precision contracts were signed. His own voice, hoarse from trying to explain. The phrase the alpha said almost lazily, that neither he nor that thing inside were needed. Even in his tone, it was clear the child was just a side effect, not something to be discussed. The door slammed. In the hallway, only the echo of his footsteps and the rush of blood in his ears remained. The city wasn't interested in whoever got thrown out of a beautiful apartment. He had signed no papers. He had nothing in his hands but a backpack. No court would bother figuring out who had thrown whom out. He was an Omega with no status, no registration, no money. He found the room in the hostel because one administrator was willing to look the other way about the lack of a contract as long as cash came in. At first, he still had the strength to pick up odd jobs, carrying trays in a cheap diner, cleaning offices at night, unloading goods. Any work where no one asked about the past and no one checked documents. Pregnancy quickly turned every shift into a trial. Nausea rolled in waves every morning. The smell of frying oil in the cafe made him throw up right in the storeroom. Standing 12 hours a shift became impossible. His legs ached, his back burned, his vision went dark. On the days when he managed to bring home at least a little money, it went to bread, instant noodles, and rent. A doctor wasn't even a topic. Sometimes he lay on his narrow bed with his forehead pressed into the stiff pillow, listening to the sounds of the corridor. Someone was arguing over the shared kitchen. Someone turned music up for the whole floor. Someone dragged heavy bags up the stairs. All of it blended into the background noise the city issued to those who lived at the bottom. Gradually, a thought crept into his mind that if one day his heart stopped beating, no one would notice right away. They'd break into the room after a few days because it had stopped bringing in money. Someone would throw his things out. Someone would take whatever seemed useful. His story would end quietly like another overdue bill. There was only one thing left he could still trade for cash: blood. Not his past, not his body as a whole, not the child, just a few milliliters of life at a time. He came across the ad by accident. His old phone with the cracked screen barely caught a signal, but ads knew how to find even those who hid. A bright picture popped up in his feed, a plasma donor center promising quick money, minimal questions, and care for donors. The amount for one visit seemed huge compared to his usual earnings. He stared at those words for a long time. With his finger, he scrolled down, reading the conditions. Passport registration, tests, no serious illnesses. Nowhere was there a direct ban on pregnant Omegas. No one wrote how it would affect the baby. Two voices flared up in his head. One, a doctor's tone from a long-ago school biology class. The other, internal, panicked. He needed money. Not in some abstract way right now. For food. For at least some medicine, so he would not die of weakness together with the one growing inside him. He wrote the number down by hand so he wouldn't save it as a contact. He called in the evening when the hostel was already buzzing with conversations and words were easier to lose in the general noise. On the other end, a nurse answered in a standard tone, explained the procedure, listed the metro stations he needed, laid out how long the first visit would take. "Payment is made immediately after," she said into the empty space between them. That phrase made the choice final. In the morning, he woke with an empty stomach. Not because the instructions said so, but because there was almost no food left. His mouth tasted sour. His head was heavy. Carefully, he touched his belly, where under the skin there was still almost nothing to feel except a slight tightness. Inside, fear for the baby stirred, thick as mud. "I'm sorry," he thought, without saying it aloud. "I don't have any other way." He put on the loosest clothes he had, the ones that hid the changed lines of his body best. A knit hoodie, worn-out jeans, a jacket that had outlived more winters than he wanted to remember. He put a folded piece of paper with the center's address into his pocket, along with the last coins for the trip. The metro always felt like its own kind of hell. The smell of human bodies, metal, cheap food. He stood holding the rail, and every jolt of the car echoed deep in his stomach. Everything inside him clenched at the thought that blood was what connected him to the baby, and that he was going to give some of that connection away. The plasma center turned out to be in a new glass building squeezed between two old ones. The lobby smelled of antiseptic and coffee from a vending machine. At reception, the girls smiled the way they taught them to, not too warm, not too cold. Here they asked for his name, shoved a form into his hands, told him to sit. He filled out the lines carefully, inventing parts of his biography. No address, no mention of his real job, no extra details. No one leaned over his shoulder. Their system had a lot of people like him. One more didn't change the picture. Before the tests, he lingered in the bathroom and looked at his reflection. His face seemed thinner than a couple of months ago. His cheekbones cut sharper, shadows sat under his eyes. His gaze had grown older. He reminded himself of the people who brought their last piece of gold to pawnshops. Blood for money flashed through his mind, bare and almost cynical. He had no choice anyway. He learned quickly which fabrics hid a changing body and which betrayed it. Loose hoodies became armor. Oversized T-shirts borrowed from donation bins behind the hostel hung from his shoulders and blurred the new curve at his stomach into a formless line. Old jeans sat lower on his hips, held up by a frayed belt that he had punched an extra hole into with a nail. In the mirror of the communal bathroom, he checked the outline from the side, then from the front, counting on bad lighting and other people's disinterest to do the rest. From the outside, nothing seemed different. Inside, everything had shifted by a few crucial degrees. His mornings started with nausea that came in slow, rolling waves. Some days he could manage a dry crust of bread and weak tea. Other mornings, even the smell of someone else's instant noodles in the corridor made his stomach heave. He learned to move slowly, to sit on the edge of the bed until the room stopped spinning, to breathe shallowly when he stepped into the shared kitchen so his body would not betray him over someone else's frying oil. Shifts had to be planned like military operations. He took whatever work he could find that did not require official paperwork, but now he chose by hours and distance. No more overnight cleaning of office towers at the other end of the city. No more double shifts in the cafe, even when the manager offered a little extra cash for staying. He aimed for a block of hours in the middle of the day, enough to earn something, with a gap before and after where he could lie flat and let his lower back stop screaming. By evening, his body always felt heavier than it looked. His legs trembled if he stayed on his feet too long. His lower back burned with a dull, grinding ache, as if he had tied a stone to his spine and dragged it around for 12 hours. There were moments when he had to lean against a wall in the stairwell, eyes closed, hand on the rail, waiting for the buzzing in his head to fade. No one saw those pauses. No one wanted to. At the cafe, where he still managed to pick up a few shifts a week, they saw only that he had slowed down. A tray that used to be light now pulled at his wrists. He could not dart between tables with the same sharp movements as before. He set glasses down with more care, checking his balance before releasing them. From the kitchen, he sometimes heard a server mutter that he was lazy now, that he had lost his edge. Once the manager's voice cut through the clatter of plates, sharp and dismissive, saying that if he did not pull himself together, there were plenty of others who would take his hours. The words hit, but not as hard as the strain in his abdomen when he tried to carry 4 heavy plates at once. No one asked why he went pale when a customer slammed a hand on the counter and started yelling about a wrong order. No one noticed the way his fingers shook after a glass shattered on the floor, and the sudden sound tore through his nerves like a blade. People saw the mess, not the person cleaning it. He became an expert at small disappearances. A trip to the storage room that lasted just long enough to sit on a crate and press his hand against his stomach. A run to the back door to take in air that did not reek of oil and old coffee. a slow count to 10 behind the fridge, breathing through a wave of dizziness until his vision cleared. In those stolen minutes, his thoughts slid backwards to places he had tried to lock away. Childhood in a neighborhood where sirens were a nightly lullaby and shouting in stairwells counted as background noise had taught him early what kinds of people survived. The loud ones with sharp elbows and louder laughs, the invisible ones who knew which streets to avoid after dark. He had been good at the second, slipping around fights, moving along walls, keeping his head down. The first time his heart had betrayed him, it was over something small. A smile at the corner store from a boy with ink stains on his fingers and a crooked front tooth. They had traded exactly 3 sentences over a packet of gum. For a week he had taken the longer route home just to pass the store again, stomach flipping every time he saw that crooked smile. It had ended before it began. An older alpha, a regular at the store, had noticed his lingering, had followed him outside once, laughing, saying that if he was going to look at someone, he might as well look at a real man. The boy with the ink stains had watched from inside and then looked away. It had been a small humiliation, one of many. It should have faded like all the others. Instead, the older alpha had kept appearing at the bus stop, near the cafe where he later got his first job, always with the same easy charm, the same confidence that came from knowing the world was designed for men like him. He brought coffee, then small gifts, then bigger ones, a scarf, a jacket, a phone nicer than anything the Omega had ever held. He had been so tired of being invisible that the attention felt like sunlight. The control had started soft. A comment about how certain friends were a bad influence. A suggestion that he did not need to work so many hours, that it looked desperate. An offer to help with rent that came with a quiet expectation. Answer his calls, be available. Slowly, his life narrowed. His days shifted around another person's schedule. When the first slap came, it was over something trivial. A message from an old classmate, a forgotten promise, a tone he apparently used wrong. The hand had been fast, the sting immediate. The apology sweeter, more intense than any kindness before. He had repeated words like bad day, pressure, stress, until they formed a comfortable lie he could live inside. The second blow had not been an accident, nor the third. Shame folded itself into his ribs, tight and silent. He did not tell anyone. Who was there to tell? The few friends he had left were ones the alpha did not approve of. He saw them less and less. He told himself that if he could just be more careful, softer, quieter, the violence would stop. It never did. Instead, the boundaries around him drew tighter and tighter, until one day they snapped, and he was on the street with a backpack and a child he had not yet met, cut out of the picture with the same brutal efficiency his father had once used to cut his own face out of unwanted photographs. Now the pregnancy was the last link in that chain. It made him physically weaker, more vulnerable, and yet it was the only thing that gave shape to his days. When he lay in his narrow bed at night, listening to someone arguing 2 doors down, to the creak of pipes and the distant siren song of ambulances, his hand always settled at his lower belly. There was not much to feel yet, just a vague fullness, but he spoke to that emptiness in his head. You are the only thing that makes this not pointless. Even the decision to sell his blood bent itself around that thought. The first visit to the donor center blurred together in his memory. The fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, the murmur of other donors flipping through old magazines. The nurse had shown him the recliner, wrapped the elastic band around his arm, tapped gently at the inside of his elbow in search of a vein. Her voice had been practiced calm when she told him to make a fist. When the needle slid in, sharp and cold, he forced himself not to flinch. Dark red flowed through the clear tubing into the waiting bag, and he watched it with a strange detachment. That was what they wanted. numbers on a screen, pressure in a bag, something that could be weighed, tagged, sold on. His body reacted the way anybody would. A wave of lightheadedness washed over him. His fingers grew cool. The nurse asked if he was feeling all right. He lied automatically, said he was fine. The sooner it ended, the sooner he could get paid. Afterwards, they pressed a wad of cotton to the puncture and wrapped tape around his arm. He sat in a plastic chair in the recovery area, elbow bent, hand pressing the cotton hard against the crook of his arm. His stomach growled loud enough to be embarrassing, and someone at the next table snorted a little laugh. He did not look up. He stared at the floor tiles until they blurred, then opened his hand to check the stain on the cotton. A small circle of blood, already darkening. His blood, not enough to matter to anyone but him. At the payment window, they counted out the money and worn bills. The sum felt unreal in his fingers, like play money, flimsy and light. For a moment, a wild thought flashed through his head of what else it could buy. A proper meal, a night in a better room, a pair of shoes without holes. Instead, he mentally divided it into smaller piles. Enough for a bottle of cheap prenatal vitamins from the discount pharmacy. Enough for bus fare to the crowded clinic in his district, where he could stand in line for hours and maybe, if the doctor was in a decent mood, get a quick glance at his chart and a vague assurance that things were not yet catastrophic. Enough for a few extra groceries with actual nutrition, not just hunger blockers. As he left the center, the tape on his arm tugging against the skin, his legs still unsteady, he did not think of the risk to himself. He thought of iron levels and protein and whatever else the thin pamphlet in the waiting room had mentioned. He thought of cells dividing, of a heartbeat he had not yet heard, of a future that refused to take shape beyond the next bill. He was invisible to almost everyone he passed on the street. Just another tired figure in a too big hoodie, walking carefully, one hand near the place where his body kept its most fragile secret. Invisible, but carrying two lives and paying for both with the only currency he had left. The first days after the donation blurred into a damp, gray stretch of time. He slept longer than usual, but woke with the same heaviness in his limbs, as if someone had poured sand into his veins. When he tried to sit up too fast, the room tilted, walls sliding sideways for a heartbeat before snapping back into place. A low, insistent ringing lived in his ears now, like a distant broken alarm that no one bothered to turn off. The money from the donor center vanished with cruel efficiency. Rent ate almost half. The rest went on vitamins, a couple of bags of groceries, cheap anti-nausea pills. The bundle of bills that had for a moment looked like salvation turned into the hollow clink of coins in his pocket. The weakness from the procedure layered itself over the pregnancy, and his body responded with protest. The metallic taste in his mouth didn't go away with water or cheap tea. Sometimes he felt it so vividly it was as if he had just bitten a rusty spoon. In those moments, a dull animal anxiety swept over him, what he had done to his own body. What he had done to someone who hadn't even been born yet. One evening he tried to walk to the nearest store. The distance that usually took 10 minutes stretched into a torturous 20. Halfway there, he had to lean against a wall like an old man instead of a young Omega. His head roared, his vision dimmed, a wave of nausea rose from his stomach. He stood there, head bowed, thinking only one thing. If he collapsed now, no one would even learn his name. When he got back to his room, he sat down on the floor right by the door without taking his shoes off. His hands were shaking. He pressed them to his belly and slowly ran his fingers over the slightly rounded fabric of his t-shirt. No more, he thought, without realizing he had formed the words. No more blood for money. The thought was simple and merciless. His body was already walking along the edge. He did not understand what exactly was happening with his blood work, had seen no graphs or charts. But he knew one thing. If he lay back in that chair under the white light and gave up another bag of blood, there might not be enough left for both of them. And if there had to be a choice, he had long known who mattered more. That decision made it a little easier to breathe, as if he had closed one dangerous door inside himself. He didn't want to open other ones. He shifted the remaining coins from one pocket to another, counted in his head whether it would be enough for a couple of days of instant noodles and a minibus ride to the clinic, and, as always, lately, refused to count any further. The phone in his life had long ago turned into an almost dead object. After the break with the Alpha, he changed his number, deleted all his old contacts, and stopped answering any unknown calls. In the very first weeks after he'd been thrown out with his backpack, the screen had still lit up sometimes, unfamiliar digits burning his eyes. He would sit there staring at the blinking icon and let the call die. Since then, the device had lived as a glorified alarm clock and flashlight. It almost never made a sound. Silence had become the only protection he could afford. That was why that evening felt wrong to him from the very start. He was sitting on the bed, his back against the cold wall, scrolling through a meaningless feed, not really reading a single post. The room was half dark. The ceiling bulb flickered like an old traffic light. In the corridor, someone was arguing. A door slammed. Somewhere outside, a car with a broken muffler rattled past. The phone thrown beside him on the blanket suddenly came to life. A sharp, alien buzz sliced through the room so loudly it felt like someone had shouted right into his ear. He flinched, his heart jumping straight into his throat. The screen glowed with a pale rectangle. On it, a long city number with no saved name. The cold in his stomach was instant, reflexive fear as old as his first bruises. One thought appeared first and would not let go. It is him. That was exactly how the calls used to start. The ones after which he had to explain himself, get ready in a hurry, go where he was told. The Alpha's voice had always found him easily through old connections and old sins. It wouldn't even be surprising if he had decided to tug on the invisible leash again. He stared at the screen and didn't move. The call went on, insistent, demanding. Blood roared in his ears, his throat went dry. In his fingers, an old impulse flickered, to hit decline, throw the phone back, pretend this had simply never happened. But this time, there was something different. Ever since he had started selling blood, the idea had lived at the back of his mind that his data was now wandering around in someone else's databases. That somewhere there was a list with his name next to numbers, weight, blood type, markers. And the way this unknown number kept ringing now fit strangely well into that thought. On the fourth ring, he finally touched the screen. Please flashed through him. Not him. Anyone but him. He brought the phone to his ear and heard, not what he was afraid of. The voice on the line was not familiar, not hoarse, not syrupy. Even fast, with that trained neutral tone they hand out with diplomas at medical schools. No trace of anger. No hint of jealousy, sarcasm, or hurt. That was how a person sounded for whom he was not an ex, but something else. Possibly just a line in a database. The man on the phone introduced himself, but the name was lost at once in the general noise of words. What mattered was something else. The way he pronounced the name of the institution. A private clinic. An address in an expensive district he had only ever seen from a minibus window. A name he'd seen on billboards and in the news, next to the phrase, "the city's best specialists." His data, the voice explained, had reached them through the donor database. After decoding his blood work, they had found a rare combination of markers. A rare blood type, a rare set of antigens, something else that sounded too technical to remember. The main point, that his transfusion had already saved the life of one very important patient. You saved a life, the voice said calmly, as a medical fact. The words were simple, but to him they sounded almost absurd. He was sitting on his sagging bed, wedged between a peeling wall and a window that had seen better days, his bare feet pressed to the cold linoleum. His legs were cramping after a short walk to the shop. The single bulb overhead flickered with the unstable electricity. You saved a life. He who was barely managing to hold on to his own. What followed was an explanation, this time dry, legalistic. The condition of that patient was still unstable. For the full course of treatment, the doctors considered it necessary to draw additional blood from him, specifically. The clinic was ready to compensate everything, and not the way the cheap plasma centers did. Transport, food, extra tests, observation by specialists in the right fields, and payment. When the voice moved on to the amount, he involuntarily straightened. The numbers came out clearly, without the usual vague phrases from his world like good money or we'll settle it on the spot. A specific sum broken into parts, an advance, a bonus after the procedures were completed, separate compensation for possible inconveniences. For someone living in the part of the city the clinic's windows looked out on, this was probably just a pleasant extra for an unpleasant procedure. For him, the sum bloomed in his head like a whole firework of possibilities. To close the debt for last month so the room's landlord would stop threatening to throw him out. To pay at least one more month ahead. Finally get a proper checkup with a specialist instead of standing 3 hours in the stuffy queue of the district clinic just to hear 3 tired words, "You're fine, next." To get a real ultrasound, to see the tiny speck on the screen and hear, maybe, the first staccato beat of a heart. His chest pulled tight with a sweet, painful ache, and then it all came crashing down like a lift without a cable when he remembered how he'd felt after the first donation. The dizziness when he had nearly fallen on the stairs. The ringing in his ears that made him want to clamp his head in his hands. The metallic taste he'd blamed on cheap food but now suspected had another cause. His body had already been working at the limit, sharing resources not only with a bag of blood, but also with the one growing inside him, taking what it needed without asking. He stayed silent while the voice on the phone carefully laid out the conditions. The sense of unreality grew stronger. In his life, people did not usually name sums in advance. In his life, no one offered to pay for the ride. In his life, any help always had a hook underneath it, invisible but inevitable. What is the catch? He thought, gripping the phone so tightly his fingers went numb. The voice seemed to anticipate such questions. It talked about standard protocols, about his right to refuse at any moment, about how his health would not be put at risk. Mandatory checkup before the procedure, mandatory observation afterwards. Everything sounded too correct, as if a whole department of lawyers and PR people had polished the script. Part of him wanted to simply hang up. To say, "No, thank you, I'd actually like to stay alive a little longer." To close this door the way he had closed the door of the cheap donor center. To save what strength he had left for the child. The other part was counting out loud how many days he could survive if he said no. How many packets of noodles would fit into the few coins left in his wallet. How many chances he had of getting into a free checkup now, when the queues at the clinic already stretched for half a day. And how long his body could endure the pregnancy without proper support while he dragged trays around and pretended everything was fine. None of the answers were reassuring. From the outside, the choice would seem simple. As a child, he himself would have easily shouted at a TV screen, "Don't go there, don't give your blood to rich people who don't care." But reality shrank to a very short line. Either he risked himself, or he risked this small, invisible being low in his belly, the one already draining his last energy, and tangled up with all those fears, calculations, and suspicions was a thin, almost shameful hope. If the clinic was that expensive, if the patient was that important, as the voice hinted so carefully, maybe they had equipment his world had never had. Maybe someone would finally look at him as a person, not as a source of cheap labor or a convenient dependent. At some point, the voice on the line fell silent and changed tone. They weren't insisting on an immediate answer. They suggested he think about it, said they understood how hard it could be to make such a decision, gave him a time and date they had tentatively booked, the morning in 2 days, when the clinic's car could come to his building and pick him up right at the entrance. "If you decide no," the voice said, "just call us back, or do not come. It is your choice, his choice." He ended the call feeling as if someone had opened 3 windows in a stuffy room at once, but instead of fresh air, cold wind and bright, offensive light had rushed in. The phone went quiet again. The room filled with its usual sounds, muffled footsteps behind the wall, the squeak of someone's bed in the next block, the occasional voices from the corridor. Everything in its place, only nothing inside him stood straight anymore. He sat down on the edge of the bed and stared at the screen for a long time. The line with the number and the clinic's name was still glowing on the display. His fingers reached for his belly by themselves. He ran his palm over the almost flat surface, as if hoping to feel an answer from within. There was no clear line between fear and hope. They intertwined like 2 different noises in one ear. One whispered, "Don't you dare, it's dangerous." The other quietly reminded him of the sum spoken in that calm voice, of the words tests and observation, of the rare, unfamiliar phrase, "You saved a life." The night passed in a half-doze. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the clinic's white light and a needle in his vein. Every time he woke, he heard in his memory the dry voice of his ex saying that neither he nor the baby were wanted. By morning, the choice was still no easier. But somewhere in another life, that early appointment already existed in a system, with his name suddenly standing next to the words, "Important patient." He felt suspended like between floors when a lift gets stuck and the doors won't open. On one side, fear that his body would not withstand it. On the other, the only real chance to pull himself and the baby even half a step out of the pit they had been pushed into together, and the time left till morning was melting slowly like loose change in a pocket. The morning did not start with the alarm, but with the feeling that the air in the room had become too tight. He woke before dawn and lay for a long time, staring at the gray ceiling, trying to decide whether he had the right to simply not go. His body felt heavy. The familiar morning nausea was rising from his stomach to his throat. A quiet pounding lived in his temples. It seemed that any movement could break the fragile balance inside. The phone lay on the stool beside him like a foreign object. He had already reread the message reminding him of the clinic visit several times. Time, address, a note that the car would be waiting outside his building. It all looked like a scene from a cheap series where the protagonist suddenly stumbles into a different world. Only here there was no camera and no retakes. Just him and a choice that had not become any easier overnight. He got up slowly, as if he'd already been beaten by someone. He washed his face with icy water from the shared taps, brushed his teeth over a sink with chipped enamel, under the indifferent glances of neighbors who had no interest in him. He pulled on the baggiest hoodie he'd found at the thrift store, old jeans, sneakers with worn-through soles. He put his passport in his pocket, the slip of paper with the address, a couple of coins. His hand settled on his belly, hidden under the fabric. Hold on, he thought. To the baby, or to himself? He didn't know. Outside, the early morning felt especially empty. Damp asphalt, puddles, garbage bins, gray walls. The cold wind probed under his clothes, but he barely felt it. It was colder inside. By the entrance stood a car unlike any that usually appeared in this neighborhood. Black body, clean windows without stickers, a deep, muted shine to the paint. Not a cheap cab, not a battered workhorse. A car that always looks out of place among peeling buildings. Next to it, a man in a dark jacket, neatly dressed, nothing flashy. He called him by name, checked his ID, and gestured towards the door. On the way to the clinic, the city looked different. He was used to seeing it from buses that smelled of sweat, wet clothes, and cheap perfume. In the distorted reflections of shop windows sliding by so fast it never felt like his life, only someone else's backdrop. Now everything was strangely quiet. The car glided almost smoothly, hardly bumping on potholes. The air inside held the scent of expensive dry cleaning and a faint men's fragrance that didn't sting the nose. He looked out the window and saw the landscape change. Shabby 5-story blocks giving way to newer buildings, men in tracksuits replaced by office workers clutching coffee cups. At the intersections, upscale shops appeared, signs, glass facades. Where he usually got off the minibus, the car was only just picking up speed. Against that backdrop, the clinic looked especially unreal, a tall building of glass and stone, no shouting signs. Only a discreet plaque by the entrance. Dark doors opened automatically as soon as you came close. Inside, the air was different, dry, cool, smelling of antiseptic, expensive coffee, and something else he couldn't name at once. It was the smell of money. Not cash, not damp banknotes, but neat, cashless flows paying for all this glass, light, and silence. The floor underfoot shone like light stone, polished so smooth you could see blurred silhouettes in it. The people behind the reception desk moved with unhurried precision, their smiles identical, as if rehearsed in front of mirrors at trainings. Not a line on their faces twitched in surprise when he stepped into the lobby in his cheap clothes. But their gaze still lingered half a second longer than it should have. They didn't leave him in plain sight. Once the receptionist said his surname, the usual logic of queues stopped applying. They didn't hand him a number ticket or send him to wait on a chair with other people flipping through magazines along the wall. Instead, they invited him behind the desk, quietly checked something, looked at a screen, and from somewhere a young staff member in a light-colored suit appeared. They separated him as carefully as fragile cargo. They walked down a corridor beginning just around the corner, off to the side of the general hall. Everything here felt different. The murmur of the lobby, the soft conversations, the clink of dishes from the coffee area, the tapping of keyboards, slowly dissolved. The walls were not just white, they were covered with a soft material that dampened footsteps. The light shone evenly without flickering. The air seemed thicker, smelling not only of antiseptic but also of something expensive. High-grade equipment, fresh linens, hidden air systems. They passed several doors, behind each of which other lives rustled. Movements, short commands, the faint beeping of machines. It felt to him like he was being led inside a foreign organism, to its very heart. At last they stopped at a door that looked almost like the entrance to a small hotel room. Inside was something he hadn't seen, linked to his own name in a long time, a small waiting room. Not a long, stuffy corridor with benches, but a soft, self-contained rectangle of silence. A carpet on the floor, muting footsteps. 2 armchairs with wide armrests, beside them a low table with a glass bottle of water and a thin glass. On the wall, a neutral painting, not screaming, not calling for attention, just a patch of color. He sat down carefully, as if afraid to leave traces of his poverty on the fabric. The upholstery under his palm was thick, expensive. He took the bottle, looked at the clear water through the glass, and felt his throat tighten with thirst. But he still drank very carefully, in small sips, as if someone might be counting them. The silence was strange. There was none of the usual clinic noise, no coughing, no swearing, no crying children. Only the distant, muted chirp of machines somewhere beyond the walls, and that sterile quiet made him even more anxious. It felt like any word he spoke would sound too loud, out of place. When the door finally opened, he flinched too hard. A doctor came in, coat neat, badge showing his name and a long line of credentials. His face was calm, tired, accustomed to other people's fear. There was no irritation in his gaze, but no warm sympathy either. More the professional attentiveness of someone whose work always involves risk. They spoke to him respectfully, but a little too carefully, as though he were not a person but a capsule with something valuable inside, easy to damage. The questions were soft but direct. How he'd felt after the previous draw, any chronic illnesses, how long ago he'd learned about the pregnancy. None of these questions carried reproach, and yet he felt as if he were sitting under a magnifying glass. When the conversation turned to the patient, the doctor's tone shifted slightly. He chose his words with care. First, he said only that the person who had received his blood was very important to a number of people. Some of them were in this building, some far beyond it. His life was tied not only to himself, but to many processes around him. At first, no names were spoken, but the context began to come together like a puzzle. Phrases cropped up like special security oversight, elevated risk level, confidentiality at all tiers. Words that meant nothing by themselves, but in this city had a very specific weight. He remembered the news, the TV left on in the cafe where he had worked before the pregnancy. Short segments where the anchor spoke in a low voice about a criminal empire, closed clubs, underground deals. A name that had become almost an urban myth. The one who controlled half the shadow market. The one they could never lock up for long, even when they showed footage of raids. The one whose face people knew from grainy photos and smeared CCTV stills. When the doctor finally said that name, it sounded oddly matter-of-fact, as if he were speaking not of a legend, but of a patient with a file in the system. He said it the way you say any sick person's name, the one with protocols and reports attached. Only a faint, barely noticeable hardness crept into his voice, not from fear, but from a clear understanding of how many people would start asking questions if something went wrong. His breath caught. He sat in the soft armchair, gripping the armrests, feeling reality tip a little. The tiles under his shoes, the glass of the bottle, the cold metal of the door handle. Everything looked the same, but the world was no longer the same. Part of his blood was now flowing through the veins of that very man whose name was whispered in alleys and spoken in the news with careful pauses. The one waiters told horror stories about on night shifts while wiping tables. The one whose life was worth not just money but an entire web of deals, fears, and hatreds. A poor, pregnant Omega, living on a folding bed in a hostel room, was now tied to an elite ICU ward and the city's shadow king by one thin but very real channel, his vein. Fear rose almost physically, not the kind he'd grown used to with his ex-alpha. Fear of a blow, a shout, a heavy hand. A different, colder form. Fear of what he'd gotten himself into without even understanding it. Fear that the game he'd stepped into for the sake of a handful of banknotes and the hope of an ultrasound might be part of something much bigger. Along with the fear came a strange, sticky sense of responsibility. He remembered sitting in the cheap donor center on a hard chair, pressing cotton to the crook of his elbow, thinking only about whether the money would be enough for vitamins. Back then his blood had just been material. A bag in a fridge. No faces, no names, only barcodes and signatures. Now it was different. If he agreed to another draw, it would no longer be a simple blood-for-money deal. Each drop would become part of someone else's body, someone else's story, someone else's power. And if something happened to him or the baby, it wouldn't remain a quiet tragedy in a cheap room. Other people would start asking questions. Very different people. The doctor seemed to sense how tightly everything inside him had clenched. He started talking again about protocols, about how they weren't interested in only the patient, how they were obliged to monitor the donor too, how he was not required to agree, how the decision remained his. The words were correct, measured. But between the lines he heard something else. The clinic could not afford to lose him, not out of pity, out of calculation. He could no longer treat his body as expendable, not because he suddenly loved himself more, but because this body had become part of someone else's schemes at a level he'd never considered. His blood had turned into a resource in a game whose rules he didn't even know. And still, there was no way back. He had gone too far to just get up and leave, slamming the soft door behind him. He had already sat in their car, walked into this glass building, allowed his surname to appear in their files next to the name of the man the whole city feared. He had already heard the sum and already mentally paid that money to the landlord, the pharmacy, and the future ultrasound. He sat in the separate waiting room with a thin glass of water in his hand and understood that any further attempt to pretend he was still no one would be a lie. The world that had managed just fine without him until now had suddenly reached out to him. A cold hand, gloved, but a hand all the same. Fear and that sense of responsibility settled on top of each other like two layers of ice. On one side, the wish to hide, to run back to the hostel, dissolve in the gray mass, where no one asks whose blood is running in your veins. On the other, the realization that now not only his baby depended on him. Somewhere behind several walls, in a room full of equipment and people in coats, lay a man whose name everyone knew. And a part of his survival hinged on the decision of an almost completely unknown Omega. He felt like he was perched on a narrow strip between two worlds. On one side, familiar poverty, endless shifts, queues at the district clinic, fear of his ex. On the other, elite intensive care, criminal ties, accounts with sums he couldn't even imagine. And in the middle, him, with water in a glass, with a child under his heart, and with veins suddenly crowded with other people's expectations. There was no way back, but he could not yet see a way forward either. Only white walls, soft light, and the smell of power that no longer left him alone. They did not take him straight to the chair this time. The morning began with paper. Forms slid across a smooth surface, his name printed neatly at the top. He signed where they pointed, each stroke of the pen thin and careful, as if pressing harder could somehow make the signature more real. Then, instead of leading him to a standard donor cubicle, the nurse asked him to wait and called someone over the internal line. The change in route was noticeable. Instead of the quiet side corridor they had used before, they led him deeper into the clinic, past frosted glass doors and panels with glowing screens. The air here smelled sharper, not only of antiseptic but also of cold metal and the ozone of machines that cost more than he could imagine. He found himself in a diagnostics wing that looked like it belonged to another world entirely. White walls, not the tired, stained white of district clinics, but a confident, expensive white emphasized by the soft light of ceiling panels. Equipment stood along the walls like silent, sleek animals, monitors with thin bezels, devices with digital displays, and cables coiled like sleeping snakes. Everywhere was that quiet, humming presence of technology doing something important. They started with simple things: weight, height, blood pressure, heart rate. The cuff squeezed his arm with steady pressure. The monitor beeped softly. The nurse frowned at the screen, tapped it a couple of times, but said nothing. Then came the electrocardiogram, sticky electrodes on his chest, cool gel against his skin, lines dancing across the monitor as his heart scribbled its anxious story. It all felt excessive, almost absurd, considering he had come here only as a donor. But every doctor and every nurse repeated the same phrase. This was standard screening before repeat drawing in special circumstances. It was about safety, his safety. They said it so often that the word itself began to sound strange in his head. Safety. As if that word had ever had anything to do with him. They took blood too. Not the quick, efficient draw from the donation center, but multiple vials, each with its own colored cap. One for clotting, one for biochemistry, one for specific markers whose names meant nothing to him. His veins submitted patiently to the needle. The skin under the plaster tingled with a blunt, dull ache. He felt lightheaded even before the results started to come back. They sat him in a recliner in a small observation room with a window onto the corridor. The glass was tinted enough that he could only see the vague shadows of people outside. Inside, it was quiet. A monitor on the wall showed his pulse and blood pressure. An air conditioner hummed softly in the corner. On the table beside him stood another bottle of water, this time with the clinic's small logo. Time stretched, his stomach twisted with familiar nausea, though he hadn't eaten since the previous night. The baby made its presence known with a dull, heavy ache low in his belly. He laid a hand over the fabric of his sweatshirt, as if his palm could become a shield between the child and this entire sterile world. When the door finally opened, it wasn't just the nurse. Two doctors came in, one younger with a slight nervousness to his movements, the other older with a heavier gaze that rarely found anything surprising. They closed the door behind them, sealing off a small space filled with the smell of antiseptic and paper files. The younger one spoke first, carefully choosing his words. He said there was a small complication, nothing immediately dangerous, but something they needed to discuss. His voice had that controlled calm of someone used to delivering unpleasant news and afraid of the reaction. The pregnancy had shown up in one of the standard tests, not even in something special, just in the routine panel they ran automatically, hormone levels, deviations, numbers that would have been just numbers to him, but to them, red flags. For a moment, nobody spoke. He knew, of course. The test with 2 lines in the drawer hadn't been a dream. The nausea, the exhaustion, the smell sensitivity. He'd been dragging all that around for weeks. But hearing it said out loud, here, in a space where his body was being treated as part of a protocol, was different. The word pregnant hung in the air like a foreign object no one knew where to put. The younger doctor's expression shifted first. His professional mask slipped. Something like panic flashed in his eyes. He started talking about risks, about how pregnancy usually meant automatic exclusion from donor programs, about additional strain on the cardiovascular system, about protocols that simply didn't account for pregnant donors in emergency chains like this. "It is a risk," burst out of him at one point too sharply. They both heard the tension in that word. The older doctor looked differently, not softer but steadier. He did not deny the risks. But every time the younger one tried to put a full stop on the matter, he quietly raised his voice and reminded him of something else, that the situation was not standard, that the patient linked to this donor was still in critical condition, that without further transfusions, their chances of keeping him alive dropped with each passing day. "We are in emergency mode," he said dryly, "and we have very few options." They argued, but restrainedly, like people who had worked together for many years and knew each other's limits. He listened to their exchange of short phrases as if it were a discussion about someone else. "We cannot risk the fetus. We cannot afford to lose the patient. There are other donors. Not with this combination of markers." The word combination drowned out almost everything else. Eventually, they stopped arguing in his presence. Instead, they said the head of department wanted to speak to him personally. The word head landed heavily, like a muffled thud on the floor. The kind of man who made decisions everyone else would later answer for. The office he entered later looked nothing like any room he'd ever been in. A spacious office with a high ceiling, a large window framing a slice of the city outside. Neat, orderly, foreign. The desk wasn't buried under papers, but the few documents on it looked dense and important. A monitor with its brightness turned low, a leather chair, a cabinet filled with medical reference books and folders. The air smelled not only of antiseptic, but of expensive paper, ink, and rare coffee. The head of department looked exactly the way he imagined someone in that position would. Middle-aged, carefully groomed gray at the temples, the look of a man who had made too many hard decisions and learned to live with their consequences. There was neither softness nor cruelty in his voice, only honesty, honed by years of practice. He did not wrap the truth in cotton. He explained it dryly, almost like from a textbook. Their patient, that very Alpha whose surname already sat in his mind like a heavy stone, had a set of peculiarities: rare blood type, rare markers, allergies to certain substitutes, previous complications. All of that together made most donors either useless or dangerous for him. Your blood matched almost perfectly, he said, not just by type, by markers, by reaction. The phrase almost irreplaceable hung in the air, even though he didn't say it. He didn't need to, he went on. One initial transfusion had stabilized some parameters, but the patient was not out of the woods. The internal damage, the blood loss, the many days in critical condition, all of it required repeated support. The next few days would decide a lot. With at least 1 or 2 additional transfusions from the same source, their chances of pulling him through passed through a narrow window that was still open. Without that, the window would slam shut. And then there is you, he added. He did not pretend the pregnancy was a minor thing. He spoke of increased risk, strain on the heart, changes in blood volume, danger of complications. He clarified that some protocols explicitly forbid donation during pregnancy. But then he brought the conversation back to reality again. Those protocols were written for standard situations. Theirs was far from standard. He offered not just money, that part was almost expected. He said the clinic was ready to pay for all monitoring. Regular ultrasounds, blood tests, vitamins, cover medications if needed, a separate room, a regime, food, maximum control. They would monitor him before, during, and after each procedure. If even a single indicator drifted in the wrong direction, everything would be stopped. He said they wouldn't hide complications. If the risk became too high, they would stop, even if it meant a worse outcome for the patient. And then he said something Ren had never heard put this way: the decision is yours, not the clinic's, not management's, not the patient's, not some elders who usually decided everything for him. His. No pressure, no guilt, no carefully tailored phrases about moral duty. Just the facts, as if 2 cards had been laid on the table in front of him, one with potential safety, the other with risk and payment. He sat in that expensive chair, his cheap hoodie looking almost ridiculous against the smooth leather armrests. His hands lay on his knees, fingers digging into the denim. His head buzzed. On one side stood the child. Small, still faceless in his imagination, but already a weight, already the center of his inner world. A pregnancy that was fragile as it was could suffer from every drop of blood taken, from every strain on his heart, from every falling number in some lab table. On the other side stood the same child, but in a different reality, one where there was no clinic, no monitoring, no paid medication, just his current life. A hostel with cold walls, lines at the district clinic where pregnant omegas in his situation might not even be taken seriously. Unpaid bills, a landlord who only tolerated him because the money was still trickling in somehow. Months ahead where any cold or bleeding episode could become the final argument. He was weighing not just two risks. He was weighing two kinds of chaos. Here in this office, the risk was concrete and controlled. Machines, doctors, protocols. People watching numbers, not emotions. Out there beyond the clinic walls, the risk was smeared and shapeless. Poverty, no access to proper doctors, constant stress that already echoed in his aching back and ringing ears. He did not care about the mafioso. The name of that alpha still gave him goosebumps. Not out of respect, but out of the same mixture of fear and disgust that soaks into any city where too many people depend on one man's will. He felt neither gratitude nor awe. Nothing in him wanted to save him at any cost. That man was an abstraction, a heavy piece on some distant board, but his own life and the child's were not. If he refused, he would go back to where he'd come from, with the same problems and no medical support. If he agreed, he would put himself and the baby at risk procedure after procedure, but in return get what he could never have afforded: monitoring, medication, a bed, proper food. It was not a noble decision. It was a calculation, cold, almost brutal. "I am not doing this for him," sounded inside him, hard. "I am doing this for us." When he finally nodded, the decision had long since ripened. His voice, when he said the short "I agree," came out hoarse but steady. There was no heroism in it, only tired acceptance. The head of department did not smile, did not congratulate him, did not call him noble. He simply nodded like a man who understood. The deal was made. Then he turned to the practical side. They would admit him to a ward for observation. They would schedule the first support transfusion for later today or tomorrow, depending on his numbers. Between procedures, he would remain under their control, not returning to his room outside the city. The word ward sounded almost luxurious. He gathered his things into a small plastic bag, though there was almost nothing to take. Phone, passport, a bit of cash that had already lost some of its weight against the promised sums. An admin staff member led him up in another elevator, down yet another corridor where the antiseptic smell was softened by hints of food and laundry detergent. His room was small by clinical standards, but to him it looked almost unreal. One bed. Not a folding cot, not a mattress on a cold floor, a normal bed, with a mattress that dipped exactly the way it was meant to. White linens, fresh, taut with no wrinkles, a nightstand, a chair, a narrow window with a view of the sky and a tiny sliver of the city. A curtain he could actually pull by himself. A call button by the bed for the nurse. There was already a tray on the table. Small but neat, soup, porridge, tea, a piece of bread, food by schedule. Not leftovers from someone else's shift, not bread with margarine at midnight. He sat on the edge of the bed carefully, as if afraid his weight would break it all. The mattress received him softly. His back answered with a kind of relief he didn't recognize. He laid his palm on his belly, feeling the warm heaviness under his fingers. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't in someone else's corner, but in a space officially considered his. The ward wasn't his home, but his name was already on the paperwork. Here he was, expected according to a schedule. Here his condition was recorded in charts. Here no one pushed him to take an extra shift if he looked pale. The side effects of being a donor were not only physical. Yes, he was facing fatigue, dizziness after procedures, possible nausea and weakness. They had already given him a sheet listing potential symptoms and explained they would monitor every one of them. But there was another side effect no instruction sheet mentioned. He was no longer invisible. His name was on lists. His numbers were discussed in case conferences. His pregnancy was accounted for in protocols. His voice was consulted before anything was done. In a world where for years he had been nothing but a function for other people's needs, this alone was almost a shock. When footsteps sounded in the corridor, he leaned back against the pillow and closed his eyes. Inside him, everything hurt and hummed, but through all of that, something strange filtered. Not safety, that was still far away, but a fragile, temporary sense of being sheltered. For now, he had a bed, clean sheets, food on a tray, and people who, whatever their motives, were interested in keeping his heart beating evenly. He had agreed to a risky deal for the child and for himself. And somewhere, a few floors away and behind layers of security, another heart was beating because of his blood. The connection was frightening, wrong, but already real. And the longer he lay under the soft light of the ward, the clearer it became. There was no way back to his old invisibility anymore. He felt the second transfusion before he knew it had begun. They didn't warn him much in advance. A soft knock, a nurse's calm voice, the rustle of plastic as she checked the line in his arm. Clear fluid first, something for hydration, something to steady his blood pressure. Then the bag with his own name on the label, his own blood returned to him in a different shape, filtered, cooled, hanging above him like a dark, heavy thought. "Just relax," someone said. "If you feel dizzy or hot, press the button." He nodded, though he already felt dizzy most of the time. The needle slid into a vein that had grown tired of needles. The pump began its slow, measured work. Drop by drop, a part of him flowed somewhere else to the other wing, through sterile corridors and gloved hands, into veins that had never known his name. In his ward, the light was soft, almost sleepy. Monitors blinked without urgency. The smell was a mix of antiseptic and something homely, like boiled vegetables from the corridor cart. Nurses passed at regular intervals, checking charts, adjusting pillows for quiet patients. His world had shrunk to the rectangle of his bed, the narrow window, the glass of water within reach. In the other wing, the light never softened. Intensive care did not sleep. Around one glass box with thick walls, the air was tighter, more charged. Machines stood in a semicircle, their screens full of dancing lines and numbers. The hum of ventilators, the occasional sharp alarm, the quick, soft voices of doctors trading information formed a layered, restless sound. Outside that box, men in expensive suits waited in a taut line like a second wall. They did not sit. They checked their phones, spoke in low voices, watched every doctor who approached the door. A few wore subtle earpieces. Others had the heavy, silent presence of trained bodyguards, eyes constantly scanning the hall. Among them moved lawyers with briefcases, assistants with tablets, people whose names opened doors and closed offices all over the city. Inside the box, under tubes and wires, lay the reason all this held together. The Alpha was pale against the pillows, the sharp lines of his face softened by sedation and swelling. Bruises bloomed under the thin hospital gown, traces of violence that had almost erased him. A tube in his throat breathed for him. Sensors clung to his chest and fingers, watching every heartbeat, every drop in pressure, every attempt of his body to give up or keep going. His blood tests read like a series of failures. Organ stress, low oxygen, coagulation problems, that rare, cursed combination of markers that made substitutes dangerous and most donors useless. The first transfusion from the unknown Omega had been a desperate, almost reckless choice. When the numbers stabilized a little, relief had passed through the team like a brief, shared exhale. The second time, it was not reckless. It was a plan. They timed everything. On one side of the building, the donor's vitals were carefully recorded before the pump started. On the other, in the intense white of the ICU, doctors watched the Alpha's lines for any sign of change. From nurse to nurse, unit to unit, information flowed. The same red liquid connected them, invisible beneath layers of protocol and steel. For him, lying in the donor ward, it began as a quiet warmth in his arm, not pain, not even the usual dizziness. At first it was just a slow spreading heat, moving up from the crook of his elbow to his shoulder, as if someone had poured weak tea into his veins. His fingers tingled, his ears filled with a distant roar like an ocean buried deep beneath his ribs. He pressed his free hand over his belly without thinking, cupping the small, solid curve inside. The baby responded with a faint flutter, more imagined than felt. His heart rate on the monitor climbed a little, then steadied. A nurse glanced at the screen, adjusted the pump's speed, gave him a reassuring nod. "It is normal," she said. "You are sensitive. It will pass." Normal. The word felt wrong and right at the same time. He lay still and breathed, counting each inhale and exhale. The warmth didn't stay politely in his arm. It slid across his chest, coiled in his throat, settled behind his eyes. For a moment he truly thought he would be sick. The metallic taste was back, that bitter coin on his tongue he'd known since the first donation. But then the feeling changed. It wasn't nausea, not simple weakness. It was something else, subtle, hard to name. A sense of reaching and being reached for. Like a hand stretching blindly into dark water and, somewhere far away, another hand twitching in response. He frowned, trying to shake off the thought. It was absurd. Blood flowed through tubes and filters under watchful eyes. There was no mystical thread, no invisible bond. That belonged in cheap, serialized dramas, not in real clinics with real debts and real mortgages. Yet when the warmth flared a second time, deeper, he couldn't pretend it was nothing. He closed his eyes, and in that dim inner space, he felt something strange. As though somewhere nearby, but behind several walls, a huge, heavy consciousness clung to an edge. Not graceful, not heroic, clumsy, animal. A life refusing to let go. Something in him answered without permission. He didn't think about the man himself, not about headlines, not about stories whispered in alleys. He thought about the way his own fingers had once hooked into a door frame when they pushed him out, knuckles white, joints aching, his body refusing to move even as fear screamed he had to. That memory overlapped with the nameless sensation, and for a few odd heartbeats, he didn't know whose desperation he was feeling. Then the pump beeped softly. The bag was nearly empty. The warmth receded, leaving cold sweat on his forehead and a strange, hollow ache in his chest. On the other side of the building, the machines told a different story. Numbers that had hovered on the edge of disaster for days began to drift upward, slowly, stubbornly, as if dragged by that same invisible hand. Blood pressure crept toward a safer range. Oxygen saturation edged above the red line. Kidney markers improved enough that one specialist allowed himself a brief, disbelieving smile. "He is turning," someone murmured. It wasn't a miracle. It was medicine, hard work, luck, and a very specific donor woven together. But in a room that had braced more than once for the sound of a flatline, the change felt like a storm turning away from the coast at the last possible moment. Outside the glass, the men in suits received the update in their own language. Short phrases, small nods, phones raised, words carried out into the city. He is stable, he is responding, he might make it. The air around them shifted from funeral heaviness to a predator's patience. Plans that had been frozen in uncertainty thawed, slid into new positions. In the donor ward, sleep came uninvited. Exhaustion washed over him once the nurse disconnected the line. His body, stripped of another portion of itself and flooded with hormones, finally insisted on shutting down. He barely registered the soft hands fixing his pillows, the blanket pulled up to his shoulders, the distant ping of monitors. He slept with his hand still resting on his stomach, fingers curved protectively over the small rise. Somewhere in the haze between waking and dreams, he felt again that sense of reaching. A faint, insistent pull, like a thread loosely tied around his wrist. He dreamed of corridors that never ended, of doors opening onto white light, of breathing that wasn't his, ragged and mechanical, slowly finding its own rhythm. In the ICU box, the Alpha moved for the first time in days without help. It started with his fingers, a small, almost invisible twitch against the sheets. The nurse at his bedside saw it, glanced at the monitors, called softly to the doctor on duty. A team gathered quickly, not in panic, but with the alert focus of people who knew how fragile this moment was. Sedation was being tapered on purpose. They wanted him to surface now that his body had something to stand on. But even with all their planning, the actual act of waking was still a jump into unknown water. His eyelids fluttered, long, slow blinks, as if each time they closed, there was a risk they wouldn't open again. The tube in his throat made breathing feel unnatural, but the machine was doing less of the work now. Each inhale took a little more weight. Each exhale gave something back. He didn't return as a legend. He returned as a body in pain, skin too tight, throat raw, chest heavy. Every sound amplified, beeps, hisses, layered voices. He tried to move and discovered restraints at his wrists, soft but firm, a precaution against panic thrashing. Easy, a voice said by his ear. Calm, professional. You are safe. You are in the clinic. You were hurt. You are alive. The words were information. His instincts weren't ready to accept them. For long seconds, his mind was nothing but static, fragments crashing into each other. Memory of gunfire. The sensation of blood leaving his body too fast. The cold, that particular cold that starts in your fingers and moves toward your heart. The sharp, brief certainty. This is the end. Then, beneath all that, he sensed something else. The smell of the room cut through the fog first. Sterile air, filtered and recirculated, disinfectant, plastic, metal, faint traces of cologne from the last doctor who leaned too close. Visitors' perfumes were barred by design, scrubbed from the air before they could reach him, and under all of that, barely there, like the ghost of a scent rather than the scent itself. Something softer, Omega, not the heavy, suffocating sweetness of clubs and staged meetings. Not the cloying perfume his enemies doused on hired companions to mock his supposed taste. This was thin, almost clean. A trace of exhaustion and cheap soap. Fear, but not aimed at him. The kind of scent that might cling to someone who worried more about rent than about choosing a brand. It was wrong. It didn't belong here, in a box where every molecule of air was controlled. He drew another breath, as deep as the tube allowed. There it was again, faint, persistent, threaded through plastic and antiseptic like a stubborn melody beneath noise. The moment he registered it, it latched onto something else in his fractured mind. Not a face, not a voice, a sensation. Falling and being caught. A border he'd been sliding toward, a cliff edge under his feet, and then a strange warmth meeting him halfway. He had known death breathing in his ear. He had also known, for one blurred second, the feeling of someone else pulling in the opposite direction. Who, he thought, but the word never reached his lips. His eyes moved instead, slow but deliberate. They found the doctor at his side, then the nurse, then the cluster of silhouettes beyond the glass, his people. They straightened when they saw his gaze sharpen, phones lifted, messages fired off. The king is awake. He didn't care about them yet. He closed his eyes again, not falling back into unconsciousness this time, but forcing his thoughts into some kind of order. The scent was there, irritatingly fragile, like a note that would be lost if he turned his head too fast. He let his mind wrap around it, cataloging its components the way he had once cataloged potential threats. Omega, young, undernourished, stressed. Not from his world. There was no expensive fragrance behind it, no familiar spices of certain districts, no echo of known families. The smell spoke of overcrowded flats, cheap detergents, long bus rides, of someone who shouldn't be anywhere near his bed and yet somehow had slipped across the line between his death and his survival. His fingers twitched against the restraints again, this time not from panic but from irritation. He hated loose ends, he hated debts he hadn't chosen. He hated the idea that someone out there carried a piece of his fate while he didn't even know who they were. A guard stepped closer to the glass, reading his micro-expressions like another language. These men had spent years learning not only his words, but the slight narrowing of his eyes that meant anger, the set of his jaw that meant a decision had been made. Their gazes locked. He couldn't speak with the tube in his throat, but he didn't need to. A tiny tilt of his head toward the door, a flick of his eyes toward the hall. A brief, sharp tightening of the muscles around his mouth that in any other context would have meant only one thing, an order: find, protect. The guard nodded once, so minimally that no untrained eye would have seen it. He stepped back, leaned toward one of the suited men in the hall, murmured a few words. Phones moved again, this time with a different urgency. Calls went not just to lawyers and accountants, but to the quieter network beneath them, the one that never appeared on organizational charts. The search didn't start with names. It started with questions: who had been brought in as a donor, what logistics had been used, which staff had handled the transfusions, whether the donor was still in the building. At first, the answers belonged to the clinic, protected by regulations, ethics, walls, but there are very few walls that money and the right kind of pressure cannot at least lean on. At his bedside, the Alpha let his eyes close again, not to escape, but to listen inward. His heartbeat now sounded less like a failing engine and more like something that might carry him through another day. Machines hummed and clicked, busy with their tasks. Voices came and went. Under it all, very faint, he still felt that strange echo, a fragile line born out of need and blood and accident. It might have been nothing, a trick of a mind returning from the edge, a scent caught once and replayed by imagination. But he had lived too long in a world where instincts kept you breathing to ignore it. In the donor ward, down another corridor, separated by security and protocol, the Omega slept on his narrow bed, curled around his unborn child. A monitor above his head traced gentle hills of a stable pulse. His face, usually pinched with worry, had softened in surrender to exhaustion. He did not know that someone with power had, in one small gesture, shifted the trajectory of his life. He did not know he was no longer just a line in a donor file, a rare blood type in a database. Somewhere, in a mind that made and unmade fates for entire districts, his existence had been registered as something else. Not yet a name, but already a priority. From that moment on, the connection between them stopped being a simple medical fact. It became an unspoken contract, written not on paper, but in the stubborn beat of two hearts that had refused, each in their own way, to stop. He did not remember the exact moment when the street dissolved and the car door shut between him and the city. Later, his memory would return only to a few points. The ex's hand clamping down on his shoulder by the entrance, a short dry enough from somewhere to the side, and the sharp scent of gun oil cutting through the sour, sweet reek of cheap cologne. Then there was the clinic corridor, lights too bright, a few quick questions from men in dark suits, and a gentle but unquestionable proposition. They were taking him. For safety for the child. For the patient whose name now hung in the air not as a request, but as an unspoken order. "You are not safe here," one of security said, and it wasn't a threat, just a dry fact. He allowed himself not to argue. The car greeted him with the smell of leather and conditioned air. The seat felt too soft after buses and the metro. The seatbelt lay across his belly, where under the loose hoodie a slight roundness was already visible. One guard sat beside him, another in front. The windows darkened. The city remained outside, like a stage where he'd performed his scene and left without waiting for applause. He stared into the black rectangle of glass, where instead of a view he saw only blurred lines of his own face, and tried to understand what he felt. Fear was familiar. What was unfamiliar was that this time his fear was being taken into account not as an irritating background noise, but as a factor in planning. "Do you need water?" the guard beside him asked after a pause, when he'd been sitting too long with his fingers clenched on his knees. He shook his head. His throat was tight enough as it was. The road stretched into an illusion of infinity. The city's noise slowly dulled, replaced by the steady hum of the highway. Sirens wailed somewhere far away, then faded. The car glided smoothly, without sharp braking, and that alone was strange. He was used to any vehicle in his life, either rattling so hard it knocked the breath from him or jerking through traffic at the command of a late alpha. When concrete walls gave way to dark silhouettes of trees, he realized they were indeed leaving the city. Outside, the smell changed. Instead of exhaust, damp earth, pine, and wet stone seeped into the air. The car turned off the highway, wheels crunching over gravel. After a few bends, something appeared ahead of the glass. Something that could have been anything but his place. The house was not a glossy magazine picture and not a brick fortress with turrets. More like a long line of light and stone behind a high fence. Steel gates opened in front of them without a sound, cameras turning slowly, tracking plates, silhouettes, faces. By the gate, two men in black uniforms didn't stand like police. Their stance was something else, more like hunters guarding a territory. They didn't look at him as at a criminal or as at merchandise. Their gazes slid, fixed briefly on his belly, on his face, then returned to the senior man in the car. "Guest," the driver said shortly. The word sounded almost absurd. A guest? Him, with his cheap fabric, lost documents, and debts the clinic now knew more about than he did. The yard was quiet. The silence here was different from the silence of his hostel room. There, it was saturated with other people's lives. Arguments behind thin walls, coughing, someone's music bleeding from a neighbor's phone. Here, the silence was dense and deliberate. It had been constructed on purpose, like a security system or an evacuation plan. They led him to the steps, where crooked concrete was replaced by even stone slabs. The door was heavier than it looked and opened from the inside, with no intercom and no questions. The smell inside hit at once. Expensive wood, clean fabrics, coffee, antiseptic, and a faint but distinct alpha scent in the background. He froze for a moment. His body remembered another door, another smell, another house. Back then, they had also brought him to a better place, promising protection, care, stability. There had been guards, cameras, locked gates. That house had quickly turned into a cage, and the alpha's scent became a signal of danger. "Breathe," he whispered to himself, barely audibly, and stepped inside. The house within turned out to be different from the last one. Yes, there were cameras. Yes, invisible sensors sat on the walls. Yes, the scent of gun oil drifted faintly from around a corner. But there was none of that sticky layer of show-off wealth he'd seen in people insecure about themselves. No gold frames, no screaming paintings, no furniture chosen purely for its price tag. A wide hallway greeted him with soft light and the sound of footsteps on wood. Whoever had designed this space was thinking not about how it would look in photos, but about how someone would live in it. They didn't take him straight into the heart of the house. First, into a separate, almost hotel-like block. On the way, he managed to notice several details more important than any words. Closed but not locked staff doors, a cabinet with a first aid kit in an open niche, the absence of the extra chains they used to reinforce interlocks at his ex's place. The guest area was separated from the main part by a glass partition. The door had no code, only a mechanical handle. The guard ahead of him held it open and gestured inside. The room met him with quiet and order. A big bed, not a folding cot. A real mattress, not sagging, not smelling of other people's bodies. Clean white linens with no strangers' stains. A small sofa by the window, heavy curtains he could close or open himself. In the corner, an armchair and a lamp. On the low table, a bottle of water, not plastic but glass, and a clean glass. The detail that hit hardest was the wardrobe. He was used to his clothes fitting into one backpack. Here the wardrobe already held several items in his size. Soft, loose t-shirts, trousers with an elastic waistband, a cardigan. On the bottom shelf lay something that tightened his throat, a small bag with an unopened baby onesie and a tiny hat. He reached out and brushed the fabric, as if checking whether it was an illusion. "Why?" he breathed, more to himself than to anyone else. "Instructions," the guard at the door replied calmly. "You and the baby get what you need." He didn't ask whose instructions. The question was rhetorical. The nurse from the clinic who'd come along with them appeared almost immediately. She checked his blood pressure, listened to the baby's heartbeat, noted something on her tablet. Her voice was businesslike, but not cold. Her gaze held no reproach when she wrote in the chart pregnancy without prior monitoring. Only professional irritation at a system that lets people like him fall out of sight. "Here you will be monitored," she said in parting. "If you feel anything strange, you call. Anything." Then they all left. The door closed behind them. It didn't clang, didn't scrape a lock. It simply shut, cutting off the corridor and leaving him alone with a space he couldn't bring himself to call either home or prison. He walked to the door, laid his palm on the handle, and checked. The handle turned easily. The corridor was there. No one stood right outside, ready to push him back in. Not locked, he told himself, and that simple phrase suddenly mattered more than anything else. He closed the door again, this time with a click. Not because someone was locking him in, because it made it easier to breathe. The first hours in the house passed in a strange, suspended state. His body demanded simple things: food, sleep, quiet. Hunger reminded him of itself almost at once, as soon as the adrenaline receded. His belly pulled. The baby answered with a tiny movement. On the bedside table lay a card with numbers. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, someone had added, "Kitchen, 24/7. He stared at those words for a long time, remembering how his ex had forbidden him to go to the fridge without permission because you'll blow up like a balloon. Now no one stood over him. No one told him when he could or couldn't. He still called, not daring to just walk out into the corridor. The voice on the other end was polite, without servility. "Can I? Maybe some soup?" he asked, hating the insecurity in his own voice. "Of course," they answered. "Anything you cannot eat?" The question sounded unfamiliar. People rarely asked what he could or couldn't. Usually they simply shoved a plate in front of him and expected him to finish it, even if the smell made him nauseous. The soup arrived soon enough. Not some luxury takeout, not cold instant noodles in a box. but simple, warm food that didn't smell of cheap spices. They left the bowl on the table, not stepping deep into the room, not surveying his few things, not commenting on the scattered contents of his bag. The same person added quietly, "If you want to see the doctor, we can call her." He shook his head. Enough for today. At night, the house sounded different. By day, it was filled with muted, soft noises. Guard footsteps in corridors, distant staff voices, an occasional ringing phone. Everything was muffled, as if the walls had been tuned not to frighten those inside. At night, those sounds almost disappeared. Only the ventilation remained and the far-off rustle of trees outside. Somewhere beyond the main wing, patrols passed now and then, a now familiar rhythm of heavy boots. But no one came to his door. No one checked whether he was asleep, whether he'd forgotten to turn off the light. He lay on clean, still unfamiliar sheets and caught himself waiting for his ex's call, for a loud voice, an order to come back, a threat. Silence answered him with indifference. This is not there, he reminded himself. This is somewhere else. The next day they offered to let him look around, not a guest tour with champagne and smiles, just a practical introduction to the space. One of the guards, not the one who'd brought him, another, younger, showed him where the nearest bathroom was, where he could get water, how to call someone if he felt unwell. He noticed how the man's gaze sometimes lingered on his belly, but it didn't grow heavy, just attentive. At some point, the guard stopped by a glass door leading into an inner courtyard. Sun shone there, grass moved, and the sound of water from a low fountain carried faintly. "You can go there," he said. "The garden is safe. Just tell us if you feel dizzy." The word "can" sounded odd. In his past life, he'd mostly heard cannot. Cannot go out on the balcony, cannot see your friends, cannot go to the shop alone, cannot even close the bathroom door all the way. He took a step toward the glass, then stopped. His body tensed. A scene rose up from memory, his ex turning a key and saying, "This is all for your safety." Back then, the garden outside had been a prison. Now the doors weren't locked, but his brain had yet to learn trust. He stepped out anyway. The air in the courtyard was different, cooler, fresher. Somewhere a bee hummed. Along the path, a staff member walked by with a basket of laundry, nodded at him and went on, not staring, not turning curiosity into scrutiny. He sat on a bench, placed his hand over his belly, and for the first time allowed himself to think, what if this place wasn't just another trap, but a waypoint between the past and something else? No one had promised him freedom. No one had said that once he recovered, the Alpha would forget him and let him go into a quiet life. On the contrary, the presence of this house, the guards, the cameras, reminded him that his existence was now tied to a man whose power could both protect and crush. But there is a difference between a cage and a fortress. In a cage, the walls are built so you cannot leave. In a fortress, they're built so others cannot get in. That evening, when the house stirred a little more, he heard the voice of the man all this revolved around for the first time, not nearby, not in his room, somewhere far down the corridor, through the thickness of walls. The voice wasn't what the city's horror stories had painted. Not a beast's growl, not the bellow of a drunk tyrant. Rather a low, controlled line with exhaustion and the habit of giving orders that will be carried out. He couldn't make out the words, just the rhythm. Sometimes the voice went sharper and then the air seemed to thicken. Sometimes softer, and in those moments the house sounded calmer. He caught himself standing in the shadow of his doorway, listening like a kid in a hostel piecing gossip from scraps of other people's conversations. The difference was that this time there was no fear of being punished for eavesdropping, only a need to understand what kind of world he had landed in. Not a monster, he thought unexpectedly. Not a savior either. Somewhere in between, that night he dreamed of his ex's house. Locked windows, the heavy smell of cigarettes and cheap whiskey, footsteps in the corridor. In the dream, his ex opened the door, smiled that same predatory smile that had always frozen his spine, and reached out a hand. He woke in the dark, neck damp with sweat, heart racing. The first thought, he found me. The second, I'm locked in again. He sat up, breathing fast, and listened. No footsteps outside the door, no voice calling his name, only the house's steady breathing, a faint hum of ventilation, a distant car on the night road, the whisper of trees. Somewhere in another wing, a machine beeped briefly, then everything went quiet. He walked to the door, touched the handle, tested it. It turned. The corridor was empty. I can open it, he said aloud, if I want. That simple sentence somehow grounded him. Old reflexes don't vanish in a night, but each small proof, a door that opens, a window he can pull the curtains on himself, a garden he can walk into without permission, added a thin layer to the new map of reality. During the day, two people came to see him, a doctor and a man he pegged by scent and manner as some kind of advisor or manager. They talked formalities. Nothing in his name would be registered yet, except medical papers. His stay here was paid by the patient. He could ask if anything was needed for the baby. Their voices held no syrup, nor ice-cold contempt. Just businesslike, almost respectful treatment of someone on whom, in fact, part of their employer's health depended. At the end, the conversation circled back to where everything had started. Safety, the advisor said. After yesterday, your ex will not come near you again, but until things calm down, it is better if you stay here. For you and for the baby. They didn't say you must, didn't say you have no choice. The offer still carried force. Behind the word better stood an army of people, vehicles, and weapons. But for the first time in a long while, a tiny gap was left for his own decision. He had no idea how long they would keep him here. A week, a month, until the birth, longer. He understood that in a world where someone's blood was keeping a mafia king alive, the concept of freedom became conditional. But for now, in this in-between, they were trying to give him not only protection, but the semblance of choice. The last years of his life had looked like a corridor whose walls narrowed endlessly. Now the corridor had widened, opening sideways into new doors, new perspectives. Some still led into darkness, but the mere fact they existed changed the layout of power. That evening, he sat on the edge of the bed, placed both hands on his belly and said quietly, "We are not home, but we are not on the street. For now, we are somewhere in between." The baby moved, as if answering. The house around him answered with silence. But it was no longer the silence of a cell where a lock clicks behind your back, and not yet the silence of a place you could call safe. Something in between. At least, not a prison. By the time the full story of the attack reached him, the Alpha was no longer a ghost behind glass and monitors. He could stand, he could walk, slowly with a cane the doctors insisted he needed, and with security that never stepped far away. He no longer hung on a thin thread of machines, but he was still on an edge. Every movement cost pain and effort. Information came to him in parts, like frontline reports. First, the clinic's dry note. The donor had been attacked at his own building entrance. Then, clarifying details from security. The attacker was no random mugger, but someone from the Omega's personal past. Later still, photos, names, connections. When the word former first appeared in a report, the Alpha's gaze went so cold, the air in the room seemed to shift. He listened and assembled the picture the way he always did, by facts. For him, a bruise on someone's face was never just a bruise. It was a sign, an arrow, a clue to someone's choices. In his world, hitting a pregnant Omega wasn't just cruelty, it was a mark of incompetence. People didn't do that because they were kind. They didn't do it because they understood consequences. Here, the consequences were already unfolding. The photographs showed what the Omega had hidden under loose clothes. Yellow and purple stains of old bruises, fine white scars where skin had once been torn. The habitual tension in his shoulders, as if his back was always waiting for the next blow. For the Omega, this was just the background of his life. So ordinary, he didn't even consider how it looked from outside. For the Alpha, every mark became a line in a ledger of debts that had to be paid. He could have ordered it all handled without him. His security was well trained enough to track the X across the city, find his bar, his friends, his usual routes. But this time the Alpha decided some of the information he needed to hear personally. His first visits to the guest block were brief. He would appear in the doorway, leaning on his cane, and the air would change even before he spoke. The scent of strength, power, and blood that everyone in this house was used to drifted inside, colliding with the thin, careful smell of the Omega, hospital, weak tea, baby cream, the nurse rubbed into his growing belly. He didn't come all the way in at first. He stopped on the threshold as if giving them time to get used to his presence. His voice stayed low without pressure. A few simple questions about how he felt, whether he needed more medicine, if he could sleep comfortably. They were almost mundane details. But above them loomed another heavier subject. On the third visit, he finally sat down in the chair opposite. Security and the doctor stayed by the door but did not interfere. The Omega sat on the edge of the bed like the edge of a cliff, trying to keep his back straight and not look at the cane that cast a long shadow on the carpet. "Tell me about him," the Alpha said. Just 3 words. But behind them stood the whole machine of his world. A request like that meant a process was starting. Data collection, target assessment, planning a response. A chill ran over the Omega's skin. He didn't start talking right away. First came fragments. A name he still found easier to say in a whisper, the neighborhood where they met. The first gifts that made his eyes light up because no one had ever thought him worthy of anything, not even cheap trinkets. The first restrictions he naively mistook for care. Do not wear this, do not talk to them, do not go there without me. Then, the first hit. Back then, still a mistake, a slip. "I lost it, sorry." And his own quiet, "It's nothing," spoken with such learned submission that now, remembering, he wanted to slap his past self. He wasn't a good storyteller, but he could mimic intonations better than any words. The X's voice slick, rising into a screech whenever someone looked at his Omega too long, his own squeezed into a whisper. The sound of a glass breaking, followed so quickly by a blow that his brain didn't have time to link the events. He talked about nights spent in the hallway because he wasn't allowed into the bedroom. Let him think about his behavior. About the day he was thrown out of the apartment with a single backpack, like unwanted trash, when the smell of another person's cheap perfume at the cafe became not a topic for conversation, but grounds for a final sentence. The Alpha listened in silence. His face didn't show open rage, only increasing heaviness. His fingers clenched on the cane's handle until his knuckles went white. At times he asked for details. When it had started, how often, whether there were witnesses, who else was involved. To the Omega, it felt like an interrogation, just without shouting. To the Alpha, it was a standard source debrief when gathering intelligence on an enemy. At some point, the Omega broke off. "I do not want to remember," he exhaled, nausea rising. "It is enough that it is over." He was wrong. In the Mafia world, enough was never enough. It was only the beginning. When the Alpha returned to his own wing, the Omega's story stopped being a personal tragedy. It became a case. His security met him in the corridor. They didn't ask extra questions. They had long since learned to read from his face what he needed. Find him, came the dry order. Find everyone who helped him. Everyone who watched and did nothing. In the criminal environment, hitting a pregnant Omega isn't just a moral line. It's a marker of unprofessional behavior. A man capable of that would eventually betray his own. He's unstable, doesn't know limits, unpredictable. Men like that aren't left unchecked, not only on principle, but out of calculation. For the Alpha, this was a double mission. On one side, personal. Someone had decided they could break another person's face and ribs, shout, humiliate, throw out into the street the one whose blood now ran in his veins and had saved his life. It felt almost like a spit in his direction from the past. On the other, demonstrative. In his world, stories told about you in bars and smoking rooms mattered. A story that he gave his donor a bed, security, and food, but left unanswered the man who had beaten him before. That would sound like weakness. The operation was prepared quickly. Information gathering took a matter of days. The ex wasn't hiding. He thought he lived in the usual risk zone. Debts, occasional fights, small-time deals. He didn't understand that now someone was looking at him from a height where all his weak spots were clearly visible. The Omega could tell something was happening even though no one told him. The house filled with a different kind of noise. More low conversations behind closed doors, more phone calls involving unfamiliar names and addresses, security's locked jaws. The Alpha's tone grew harder in those rare moments when he tossed out crisp orders. He tried not to listen. But the hearing that had once saved his life couldn't be switched off on command. One morning, as he was drinking tea on the terrace, one hand on his belly and the other on his cup, the same advisor who'd explained the house rules came up to him. "Things are being handled," he said, sparing details. "You do not need to worry about him anymore." It was meant as reassurance. Instead, something clenched inside. "What does it mean?" he asked quietly. The advisor paused, weighing his answer, then chose honesty. "It means he will not be able to touch you again, or anyone you care about." There was too much in those words for him to accept them cleanly. By evening, the rumor reached him. He didn't know the details. He didn't see footage or read reports. But in the voices of guards returning from runs, there was relief with a metallic aftertaste, like they'd just finished a job they considered necessary, but not pleasant. Somewhere in the city, his ex had been beaten. Maybe they broke a few bones. Maybe they took his business. Maybe they spooked the ones who stood next to him. In some basement, behind a closed door, someone had explained very calmly where the line he'd crossed lay. "Every hit has a price," the Alpha had once said when talking about past wars. "You pay it now, or it comes for you later." Now that principle had applied to one man whose fists had gone too long without consequence. The Omega wasn't supposed to know. But news seeps, first through a nervous laugh from a junior guard who slipped up in the kitchen, then through a carefully disguised explanation from the doctor of why he no longer had to worry about his ex showing up at the gate. "He is busy with his own problems," the doctor said cautiously, but clearly enough. For a very long time. That night he lay awake, the baby moving under his palm, and a thought spun in his head he couldn't shake. Every blow he'd taken in the past was now turning into an argument for another blow handed out somewhere else. Every slap, every bruise became a line in a list of charges the world of violence used to justify hitting the one who hit him. He didn't pity his ex. He had no sympathy, no attachment left, only disgust and exhaustion. But the mechanism itself scared him. One person inflicts pain on another. The second, once he holds power, responds with greater pain. Somewhere between the two, a child grows, a child who will be born into a world where every punch is a debt someone comes to collect. He didn't want to be the cause of another war. He didn't want his story to become a legend in criminal tales, the donor because of whom they ruined so-and-so. He didn't want his name, or even just his image, to become a convenient excuse. One day, gathering the scraps of his courage, he spoke to the Alpha about it. They sat in the garden. Sun filtered through the leaves. Wind carried the smell of damp earth. Security stayed back, but close enough to intervene. The Alpha looked better. His skin was no longer as pale, his movements more assured. Only the scar under his open shirt reminded them how close he'd come to the edge. "I do not want this to be about revenge," the Omega said at last, pulling each word out of his throat. "I did not give blood for that." The Alpha stayed silent for a long time. His gaze was heavy, but not cold. "It's not about revenge," he said. "It is about making sure he never does it again." The words were logical. In his world, that's how it worked. Don't take down the beast, and it comes back. Don't break the hand that hits, and that hand will rise again. But for the Omega, that logic felt like another link in the chain he was trying to escape. Blow, response, new blow. "Where is the line?" he asked in almost a whisper. "Between protection and the same thing. Done by different hands." The Alpha didn't answer right away. For perhaps the first time in a long while, he had no ready-made formula. His life rested on clear rules: ours, theirs, debt, payment, hit, answer. Now the man who kept him breathing was asking a question for which there was no simple scheme. "Maybe," he said at last, slowly picking his words, "the line is where you stop before it reaches the innocent." He meant, don't touch those who have nothing to do with it. Don't scare the neighbors. Don't burn down a whole block for the sake of one person. Don't use a child as leverage. For him, that was already a huge step, to limit his own rage, to make the operation precise instead of carpet bombing. In his world, that was considered almost softness. For the Omega, it wasn't enough. He watched one world of violence punish another and understood that in essence, it was still the same loud orchestra of blows, just with a different hand holding the baton. He couldn't change the past, couldn't rewrite the character of the man who carried his blood in his veins. But he could make a choice for himself and for his child, not to tell his baby this story as a fairy tale about righteous vengeance, not to turn the Alpha into a hero, not to turn his ex into a convenient villain, to leave it as what it really was, a chain of bad decisions for which someone ended up paying a higher price. The inner conflict didn't disappear. It lived on like a quiet, constant ache. Every time he walked past a window and saw men with weapons in the yard, he remembered that those same hands knew how to protect and how to break. Every time a guard opened a door for him, he thought about another door somewhere in the city, a door that had already been closed for good in front of the man who once thought he owned him. At what point do we become them? He asked himself, watching the Alpha issue another order. There was no answer, but that question became his inner marker, the very boundary he didn't want to cross himself, the thing that would define what kind of father he'd be, the one who teaches a child to hit first, or the one who at least tries to explain why every blow has a price someone will pay for the rest of their life. The city underworld adjusted to any shift in the balance like water flowing around a stone. When the story about a pregnant donor taken under protection spread through underground bars and closed chats, many took it as just another tall tale. But those who listened closely heard the main thing. The mafioso had a new weak contour, a place where his armor looked thinner, a pregnant Omega living in his house, the one whose blood had pulled him out of a coma, the one for whom security moved like a single system, rerouting convoys, closing streets, cleaning up loose ends. Someone saw a hook in that. Tension thickened in the house. The Omega felt it in small things. Security became a little more focused. Eyes slid more often over windows, gates, rooftop lines. Routes to the clinic stopped being routine. Sometimes the cars turned off early. Sometimes they changed roads at the last second. Sometimes they canceled the trip altogether if the air smelled wrong. They explained it gently. Threat rivals. People who didn't like that their main enemy had survived, and now, instead of weakening, had acquired one more reason to dig in and protect. "You are important," the doctor said, checking the sensors on his wrist where a tiny tracker was hidden under the skin. "Not because you're a thing, because you're a life. 2 lives." He wanted to believe that. But the part of him used to any attention eventually turning into control kept listening warily to the footsteps outside his door. The day everything snapped started like any other. Morning soft light in the window. A light breakfast he forced himself to finish despite the nausea. The security car at the steps. That same black vehicle whose leather seat smell he now recognized from the first step of the porch. The standard phrase from one of the escorts, spoken in an even tone. "We'll take Route 3. He got in, buckled up, laid his palm on his stomach. A small movement inside answered with a gentle kick. Everything looked almost routine. Almost. The city breathed beyond the glass. Streets stretched in familiar lines, but at one intersection the air suddenly changed density. The car slowed as if it had run into an invisible wall. Ahead, a van stood across 2 lanes at once, blocking the road. The driver swore under his breath, but professionally, weighing whether he could get around. At the same moment he decided to reverse, something hit the rear bumper. Not hard, but enough to jolt the car. A second vehicle that had appeared out of nowhere. After that, everything happened fast and polished. The guard beside the Omega unfastened his belt, reached for his weapon. But the man who yanked the door open moved with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Gas. A sharp scent the Omega registered before he understood what was being pressed to his face. Fabric over nose and mouth. A body reacting too slowly. No, he managed to think in that tiny gap between the breath and the blackout. Not again. Just not like this. The world dropped away. He came to in a dark space that smelled of dust, old oil, and other people's fear. Not a hospital room. Not the house. Something between a warehouse and a garage. A hard chair beneath his back. Wrists tied behind the backrest, legs strapped down. His body throbbed with a dull ache in his skull and a deep, dragging pain low in his abdomen. The first thing he did was listen inward. The baby was moving, quietly, distinctly. Not panic, just the familiar shifting. The knowledge went through him like a warm wave and steadied his breathing. He wasn't alone. And as long as there was that movement inside, the world hadn't completely shattered yet. Voices came a little later. Someone was arguing behind a metal door. One voice rough, confident, with that worn-out anger you hear in people long used to dirty work. The other younger, climbing to higher notes whenever he spoke too fast. He's shaking. Did you see that? Pregnant, for fuck's sake. Even better. He knows what we can do. The words crawled under his skin, but not the way they used to. Back in his ex's apartment, any threat had paralyzed him. Now something in him stepped back and watched from a distance. They were offering him a familiar role again. Silent object, center of threats. Bait. They came in when he was already used to the half-dark. 2 of them. The older one had a face that seemed permanently stuck with a cigarette in the corner of his mouth. The younger tossed a knife from hand to hand, like a teenager trying too hard to look dangerous. The older gave him a quick, assessing look, noting the roundness of his belly, the straps, the faint mark from a catheter on his arm. "So," he said, "here's our hero. There was no respect or hatred in his voice, only calculation. To them, he was a number in someone else's equation. They talked about how the Alpha needed to understand he couldn't spend resources on one Omega while there were other players on the board. About how the call was ready, how soon someone would turn on a camera, and all the Omega had to do was look scared, say a few words, show his belly, remind everyone how much a child's life is worth. The pressure was familiar, crude hints, phrases about what happens if you don't cooperate, vivid, filthy descriptions of possible consequences for the baby before he would have gone silent and waited for it to be over. Shut his eyes, pulled inward, enduring another hell while convincing himself he had no choice. Now there was something else inside. All the weeks in the house, conversations with doctors, long nights where security patiently explained how the systems worked. Lessons he hadn't thought of as lessons. How an alarm circuit is built, where any door has a weak point, how people behave when they're not sure of their own plan. He remembered the doctor's quiet voice when she had shown him the red button beside his clinic bed. If you feel bad, press. Even if it seems like it's not that bad, you have the right to call for help. Back then it had seemed like a luxury. The right to call. Now he understood no one would give him a button here. He'd have to make one himself. He started small. He let himself shake harder than he really was. Looked not at the older man, but at the younger, the one whose voice cracked. Wrapped himself in the image of a frightened, broken victim they expected, and watched the effect. The older grew more confident, the younger more irritable. His hand with the knife trembled. He said, "Shut up," far more often than needed. That was the weak channel. A hairline fracture. He asked questions that looked like fear. Will he really come? Are you sure he'll pay? What if he doesn't care? The words were calculated. The younger flared like a match. He cares, he snapped. He already locked half the city down because of you. Think about who you've attached yourself to. That was all the Omega needed to confirm. The kidnapping wasn't random. They had already tested the Alpha's reaction, knew he was moving cars, people, money. Their plan hinged on squeezing him into concessions. The older hissed at the younger for saying too much, but the words were already out. Small pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. He listened to the space. Warehouse or garage. High ceiling. Distant muffled hum of the street through metal walls. Somewhere to the side, water dripping into a bucket. The smell of old wood, cardboard, dust. And another faint note. Electricity, insulation, warm wiring. There had to be a fire panel somewhere, an alarm. Something required by law, even if people obeyed it only formally. When they left him alone, locking the door, he started searching. He couldn't move freely, but he could test boundaries. He pressed the chair against the walls, feeling the surfaces. Smooth metal, cold concrete. In one spot, a thicker square. Plastic, a panel. Under the paint, he felt two round dimples. He steadied his breathing. Fire alarm. The problem was that he was tied to the chair. Hands behind the back, legs bound. Reaching out to press anything was nearly impossible. Nearly, he began to rock. At first slightly to get used to the swing, then harder. The chair creaked, loud and grating. Someone grunted behind the door but didn't come in. They were used to the sounds of fear. He made it look like pure panic. Breathed fast, let short, broken sobs slip out. Inside, the baby's movements reminded him what he was doing this for. Just don't fall on your belly, he ordered himself. Everything else is acceptable. Each new jerk dragged the chair a bit closer to the wall. The plastic panel was very close now. He could feel it with his shoulder. One more pull, another. The fall was loud. The chair crashed onto its side. The impact landed on his shoulder and hip. Pain flared, but his belly rolled away as he'd planned. His hands ended up closer to the wall. Numb fingers that still obeyed fumbled for the plastic. He shoved at the panel with his palm, his fingers, his knuckles. At first, nothing. Then, a quiet, almost inaudible click. The alarm didn't erupt in a deafening wail like in the movies. It first pulsed somewhere deep in the building, a low, unpleasant hum. Then, after a few seconds, a red light started blinking above the door. He heard the voices sharpen outside. What the hell? Who touched the panel? Panic in the kidnappers was good for him. Any disruption to the plan made people sloppy. Water started to seep from above. Somewhere, an old, never-tested sprinkler had burst. Drops hit the floor, his hair, the chair. Dust lifted with the smell of damp. In the distance, beyond layers of metal and concrete, another sound joined in. Sirens. Not movie sound effects, real ones. Emergency services and, quite possibly, the Alpha's security cars that had long been tracking any alarm spikes in the district where he had people. The door flew open. The older guy burst in, swearing, "What did you do?" He loomed above, seeing the toppled chair, the Omega on his side, wet hair, wide eyes. The picture looked like pure, helpless fear. The Omega didn't explain, just turned his own plan into what they expected to see. "I fell," he gasped. "I'm sorry, please, the baby." The words sounded genuine enough to hit a basic instinct. Even someone used to dirty work reacts when a child is mentioned. The older cursed but lifted the chair, set it upright, checked for blood. The younger darted around the warehouse, checking panels and wires. His voice climbed higher. "We need to get out." Now, the plan was collapsing. The Omega felt something turn over inside. He was no longer the center of someone else's scheme. He was the one breaking it. They had tried to use the pregnancy as leverage, talked about the child as something to threaten with, but it was the pregnancy that pushed him into action. "I am not going to just sit here waiting while you decide how much my life is worth," he thought. "I'm not going to be hauled around like a sack again." Noise was rising outside the door, not just kidnappers' voices now. Engines, the harsh screech of brakes, orders barked in short, hard phrases. Someone yelled, "Fire brigade," someone, "Police," someone called the Alpha's name. The mafioso's security was fast. The tracker in his skin, the one he'd almost forgotten about, had long since sent his coordinates. The fact the fire alarm had gone off in the same place only confirmed something serious was happening here. Maybe that was what saved his life. Not one button, not one plan. A coincidence of several lines. But the key difference from the past was that he'd been the one to pull the thread. He couldn't control how many people were clashing at the warehouse door. Couldn't decide how hard the Alpha would hit back. But for the first time in a long while, his choice had been aimed not at passive survival, but at resistance. "Not again," he repeated to himself, feeling the door tremble with blows from outside. Not as a victim. Pregnancy stopped being only a burden that made him the weak link. It became a point he pushed off from. Not, "I must live at any cost because someone else said so," but, "I want my child to have a world where I don't teach them to endure it." When the first bullet hit the metal wall, when shouts tangled, when the older man lunged toward him with a "don't move," the Omega already knew one thing. Even if everything ended as dirty as it had begun, he wouldn't remain who he used to be, not furniture in someone else's story, not a tool, not a victim, a person who, in the moment he was tied and helpless again, still found a way to reach for the emergency cord and pull the alarm himself. After the warehouse, everything broke into fragments. Other people's screams, flashes of light, the ringing of metal, the smell of burning and blood. His mind shrank to one thought. Is the baby breathing? Everything else dissolved into white noise. Consciousness snapped back like a rubber band. First came sound, the steady, confident beeping of one machine counting a heartbeat. Another rhythm, faster, with a slight tremor, the monitor tracking the fetal pulse. That sound cut through the fog like a single bulb in a basement. The baby was there, alive, stubbornly beating in their own tiny world. Then came sensation, soft, almost sticky sheet fabric against his skin. The smell of antiseptic, a dull ache in every muscle, especially his side and shoulder. A mild heaviness in his hand where the IV needle sat in his vein. His body felt foreign, but it was there. He was no longer tied to a chair, no longer falling, no longer choking on gas. He was in a room he recognized by sound before he even opened his eyes. Not the public hospital, not the donor center. That same private ward as in the first days, the even hum of filters, distant steps in the corridor, muffled voices of staff trained to speak softly. He tried to move. His body answered with a wave of soreness. Fabric rustled nearby, a different scent leaning over him. Clean cotton scrubs, light perfume, a thin thread of coffee. "Don't move yet," the doctor said gently. "You're on a drip." He nodded, not even trying to form a question. All of them had folded into one. The doctor understood. He took his hand and carefully laid it on his belly, where the sensor caught every beat. "The child's heart sounds good," he said, now in a completely different tone, not professional, not distant, almost personal. "There was a short period of stress, but right now there's no threat. You're both alive. That's the main thing." The word "both" settled on his chest like a heavy, warm weight. He closed his eyes, not from pain, but from relief. His throat tightened. Tears came without sobbing, just quietly spilled out while he lay there listening to that small engine inside him. Keep going. Consequences, as always, came later. Doctors talked about stress, about spasms, about how far they'd walked along the edge. His tests showed a tired body, wrung out reserves. Every new bruise on his skin wasn't just a mark from a stray hit or fall. It was the price paid for someone's decision to stage a war around a pregnant body. He looked at his hands, covered in bluish-yellow stains, and thought, not long ago he'd offered these veins voluntarily for a handful of bills. Back then, it had felt natural that blood was just another resource, like time, health, attention, something you could trade for rent, food, cigarettes for neighbors, a couple of pills. Now each mark suddenly felt like evidence of a deal that had gone way too far. On the third day after the kidnapping, they moved him from the high dependency unit back to the familiar room in the mafioso's house. Same bed with its adjustable backrest. Same view of the garden, leaves rustling behind the glass. Only now the room held more equipment and more people. A monitor by the headboard, a small portable fetal Doppler, and security at the door who clearly did not belong to the same world as anesthesiologists and nurses. The house, which had recently felt just like someone else's property, now breathed differently. The corridors were used not only by doctors but by plainclothes men with the heavy smell of weapons at their belts. Outside the window at night there was the muted sound of an engine idling by the gate. The protection system had risen to a level he'd never noticed before. Inside the room, though, there was a surprisingly delicate quiet. No one spoke about what had happened at the warehouse. No one rumbled aloud about who had given the order, who fired, who made it in time, and who didn't. All of that happened out there. In here, the doctors talked only about blood pressure, nutrition, blood counts, and that was where the most frightening thing caught up with him. Not the fear of dying, but the fear of once again becoming someone's resource. One morning, the head of department came in, the same one who had explained donor rules to him in the elite clinic. He sat down so they were at eye level, laid a tablet on his knees but didn't switch it on. "We've reviewed your numbers," he began calmly. "What happened at the warehouse was the last point. No more transfusions, neither scheduled nor emergency. Your body is already at the limit." The Omega stayed silent, but something clenched painfully inside. A part of his survivor brain protested quietly but desperately. What if he needed the money? What if they called again with a sum he couldn't refuse? How would he live without this last crutch? As if reading those doubts, the head of department went on. "You've already saved his life, several times. You don't owe anyone anything. The main patient and his people understand that. From today, your blood is only yours. And the baby's. No longer as a resource, but as part of a body that must be treated carefully." The phrase, "your blood is only yours," sounded unbelievably strange. As if all this time he'd been walking around with something everyone but him had a right to. And now he'd suddenly been handed a title to it, even if only in words. When the doctor left, leaving him alone with the IV and the monitor's measured beeping, he stared at the thin, clear tube going into his vein. His blood moved through his vessels without pouring into someone else's bag, without flowing into another body. It stayed inside, worked for him and the one under his heart. A simple thought hit with unexpected force. "I'm not merchandise anymore." He didn't say it out loud, but inside it sounded louder than any scream. It filled his chest, wrote itself into every heartbeat. He suddenly saw his whole life through that lens. Childhood, where he gave his time and attention to adults who exploited his obedience. Teenage infatuation, where he gave his trust to an alpha who turned his body into a training dummy for his own issues. Donor centers, where he gave blood just so he wouldn't starve that day, every time he'd been someone's source. Convenient, silent, grateful for pennies. His yes had never really mattered. His no had never been considered a real option. Now, another line clearly formed inside. That same day, a new shadow appeared in his doorway. The Alpha didn't arrive with a parade or a full entourage. The Omega felt his steps before he heard the handle turn. They were heavier than a doctor's, but there was no predatory pressure in them anymore. Instead, the caution of someone unsure whether he has the right to enter. He looked different than in those rare, blurred glimpses from before. No immaculate suit, simple dark clothes, a bandage on his wrist where a catheter had recently been. A little more pale, with fatigue at the corners of his eyes. For a man the city feared like a half-mythical figure, he looked, in that moment, like a very tired person who had almost died and had nearly lost another life through his own fault. The air in the room thickened. The Omega suddenly understood that something far more important than a security scheme was being decided right now. The Alpha came closer, his gaze taking in the monitors, the Omega's face, the IV in his hand, the swell under the thin blanket. His eyes lingered there, on the belly. For a heartbeat, pure, unhidden fear flashed there. "I was late," he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, like someone who hadn't slept for days. "A little more and—" He broke off, as if aware this room had no use for hypothetical endings. He didn't say, "I'm sorry." Too many years of command had probably made that word almost physically painful to him. But his silence, heavy and honest, sounded louder than any polished apology. The Omega looked at him and, for the first time, felt neither awe before the figure the city had turned into legend, nor the old animal terror with which he'd imagined the mafioso as a faceless monster from the news. He saw a man who had made decisions that put him in danger. A man who had saved him several times, with money, with guards, with doctors. And a man who was now, in essence, responsible not just for his own scars, but for every fresh line on the Omega's skin. "I saved your life," he said quietly, looking not at his face but roughly at his chest, where the heart beat under the shirt. "You saved me housing, a doctor, safety, we're even." The phrase didn't sound like a cold calculation, but like a line drawn in pencil on a map. He was surprised at how steady his voice was. Nothing inside him shook. The Alpha nodded. Relief flickered in his gaze, mixed with something else. Respect, perhaps, which he didn't often feel for people he dealt with. "We're not even," he said after a pause. "I can't give you back what you've already done, but I can at least not take more." That a not take became a point of support. The rest of the talk was short. No grand promises, no oaths to protect him for life. Both of them knew too well what such words usually cost. Instead, the Omega voiced aloud what he had already formed inside. He said he would no longer agree to transfusions, even if the clinic called again. That his blood was not a lever in negotiations. That the child would not be a piece of collateral in someone's deals. That if he stayed near this Alpha, it would not be as a faceless donor and convenient target, but as a person whose yes and no meant something. "If you want me here," he finished, feeling each word burn his throat, "you accept my body outside of any deal. This is not a clause in a contract. This is my boundary." He'd expected pushback, attempts to soften, bypass, rephrase. In his past, every man he'd relied on had tried to bargain against his boundaries sooner or later. The Alpha only nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Your blood is yours. Your decisions, too." There was no trace of condescension in his voice. Rather a strange shade of respect for someone else's no that he perhaps hadn't allowed himself before. Then the meeting was over. The Alpha left, taking with him the smell of the street and gun oil. Only antiseptic, the faint scent of food on the tray, and the Omega's own breathing remained. But the air was already different. He lay there, listening to the drip ticking down the line, and began mentally rewriting his inner contract. Before, his life had been a set of other people's clauses. Do not go out without permission. Do not argue. Always be grateful. Always be available. Now the lines were forming differently. His blood, not for sale. Not for money, not for safety, not for anyone's salvaged reputation. His body, not a lever. His child, not an argument in someone else's feud. He might live under the roof of a man half the city feared, but that didn't make him part of a collection. He could accept gifts and protection, but that didn't cancel his right to leave if he ever again smelled a cage. The house, which had once seemed a temporary refuge, started to take on different outlines. Not an ideal place of power. He clearly saw the weapons in the halls and knew what foundation this house stood on. But for him personally, it became the point where the cycle of violence had finally cracked. The chain blow, endurance, gratitude for scraps had stopped. His blood no longer flowed where someone else's hand pointed, but where nature and his own choice dictated. Inside, to the child, to his heart, to the fingers that would soon be clutching a new person. And if he ever did decide to give some of that blood again, it wouldn't be so that someone owed him. It would be for his own reasons. For what he decided mattered. For the first time, his life wasn't balancing other people's debts, but his own account. One he kept only before himself and the tiny being that kept beating against his palm. The birth wasn't the pretty picture from an ad. It was long, sticky with sweat and tears, the light cutting into his eyes, the pain dragging every old fear back up from memory. At some point, when the contractions rolled in one after another, he thought he was back in a donor chair, the same feeling of his body being squeezed to the last drop. Only this time, no one handed him an envelope and no one talked about leaders. But somewhere between another wave of pain and the midwife's panicked whisper, a new sound broke through. A hoarse, outraged cry that tore through the hum of machines and the roar inside his skull. Nothing in his life had ever sounded as loud as that first breath. Then there was warmth. A heavy, hot bundle on his chest, the smell of milk and blood mixed with antiseptic. He lay there, exhausted to the point of nausea, and looked down at the crumpled red face, trying to connect everything that had led to this point. The cheap donor center, the cold of plastic couches, the sharp voices counting his blood in milliliters. And now, those tiny fingers clutching at his skin as if it were the only anchor left in the world. "You're here," he whispered more to himself than to the baby. "We're both here." The mafioso's house didn't transform overnight. Security didn't vanish. Cameras still clicked quietly in the corners. Behind closed doors, negotiations went on about supply chains, influence, people whose names weren't spoken aloud in the corridor. But another layer had been added to that background. Nighttime crying, the steady shuffle of feet with a bottle down the hall, the soft laughter of a tired Omega who couldn't believe he knew how to laugh so easily. Visitors who once came only on business now sometimes lingered at the nursery door. Some turned away awkwardly, unsure how to act near a crib, in a house where problems were usually solved with money and guns. Others softened, dropping their voices half a tone as if afraid to scare the newest resident. For him, the house stopped being just a functional shelter. It turned into a strange but living space where danger and care coexisted. On the same floor, there might be a room with documents outlining pressure on competitors, and next door, a room where a ridiculous mobile of cloth animals hung over a crib, bought in a hurry and with no taste, but with a desperate desire to bring a bit of joy. The scars didn't disappear. Lines remained on his body, bluish traces of old fractures, pale, healed cuts. Sometimes under the shower, hot water slid over them, and his memory threw up images, a raised hand, a cold voice telling him it was his own fault, the snap of a glove as a nurse searched for a vein. There were scars inside, too. Nights when the baby's cry would trigger another scream in his head. His own body wrung out on a donor couch. Days when any loud sound in the hallway made his shoulders rise and his breath shorten into those same old, shallow gasps from cramped communal corridors. The difference was that he no longer let those scars rule him. They were facts, not a sentence. He learned to live with them as part of a story he could look at, not just from within. Sometimes when the baby fell asleep on his chest, he would lightly trace his most visible scar with his fingers and say, inside, "This happened. Someone did this to me. But it's not everything I am." Blood, which used to be his only currency, took on another meaning too. He remembered the donor center in painful detail. Dim light, the smell of cheap antiseptic, cracked linoleum, the administrator's flat voice announcing the amount like the price of an unwanted item. Back then, it had seemed like he had no other way to talk to the world except by trading his liters for another bag of grain. Now the blood flowed in a loop of him, child. The same type, the same markers that had once lit his ID red in an elite clinic now pulsed in the baby's veins. In the body of the alpha the city called a predator. Part of his blood ran too. The thought still felt strange, almost unreal. But it no longer gave him the sense that someone owned him. More a fragile sense of connectedness. His life had once branched out into other bodies and then come back in the form of handshakes, guards beneath windows, and a tiny breath in the dark. The mafioso himself changed slowly, the way a large, heavy mechanism shifts after years of working in only one mode. He didn't become soft in any conventional way. His voice could still slice a sentence to the bone. His decisions still broke careers and shut down businesses. But there was a subtle difference in where his power was aimed. Before, all his force had been oriented at keeping himself and his structure intact at any cost. Now the axis had moved. There was someone in the house he couldn't justify another cruelty to with, "That's how it has to be." A tiny person who understood none of the hierarchy except one. The one who holds you and smells like safety is yours. The Alpha learned to speak more quietly when he entered the room where the child slept. Learned to hold back in those moments when his first instinct was still hit first. Sometimes he failed. The world was too dirty to survive without hard decisions. But even on days when he came home saturated with the winter air and the scent of someone else's blood, he would stop at the nursery threshold and pause, breathing deep before going in. The house never became a sterile fairy tale. There were plenty of hard talks. There were scenes where the Omega, clutching the child, said in a level voice that he didn't want the little one hearing the news of who had been removed today. Sleepless nights when the question, "What if they find another way to hit you through us?" hung between them like a heavy stone. Days when memories came so hard he would walk to the far room, close the door, and just sit on the floor counting breaths to reassure himself, "Here, now, no one is touching me." The key difference was something else. He no longer saw himself as extra. Before, he'd been background noise. The unwanted Omega in a pretty apartment where all decisions were made without him. A nameless donor on a list where his ID mattered more than his name. A tenant in a hostel everyone forgot about as long as he paid on time. Now he was the center of someone's world. For the child, his voice was the frequency safety tuned itself to. For the Alpha, he became not only the one who had once given blood, but also the one whose questions forced him to redraw habitual schemes. He started his day not by counting coins or calculating whether he had enough blood for another visit to the center. He started it by checking whether the baby was breathing, and with a quiet cup of coffee in a kitchen where trees swayed outside, not dead walls of panel buildings, the past didn't disappear. It lived in scars, in flashbacks, in the cold in his hands, when the smell of hospital antiseptic was too strong. But he stopped seeing it as a chain trailing after him forever. One day, sitting in the living room, while the child rolled on the carpet and the TV murmured the news in the next room, he caught a strange thought. Everything that had happened to him wasn't a finished script. It looked more like a score where the lines could be changed. The old notes, donor center, echo of blows, screams, the pounding of his own heart in a dark stairwell were still there. But new lines had been laid over them, the child's voice, the rhythm of footsteps through the house, the Alpha's steady, slightly rough breathing beside him at night. Where once there had been only alarm, there were now pauses with room for silence, not just the expectation of another hit. The scar on his body was the same. But now, when he ran his fingers over it, he saw not only the pain that made it, but everything that had grown on top. The ability to say no, the right to refuse, the readiness to defend not only someone else but himself. He was the one who had once gone to donate blood so he wouldn't starve, and ended up in an elite clinic under the rare donor line. The one who saved the life of a man the whole city feared. The one who almost became just another lever in someone's war, and at the last moment refused to be a thing, and the one who, in the end, saved not only someone else's heart, but his own. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments at which moment you felt it the most. In the cheap donor center, in the sterile elite clinic, in the house that could have become a new prison but turned into a refuge, or in the scene where the hero chose for the first time not to be a victim. Subscribe to the channel BL Story of Love and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next forbidden BL story about how even the most broken past can be rewritten if you stop selling your blood and start valuing it yourself.